Welcome everyone. Thank you all for coming and being ready to engage with climate change. This conference, my name is Siri Eriksson, I'm a professor at NMBU. This conference is an activity under the NMBU Sustainability Arena towards sustainable cities and communities. The arena aims to strengthen interdisciplinary research and teaching on sustainability. This conference is student-driven and is one of our innovative teaching activities under the arena. As part of their coursework, master students in climate and society are organizing this conference, choosing the theme of the conference. They've come together in groups to organize each of the sessions, deciding on the topic and the format. In addition, students from a course in climate economics at the School of Economics and Business have also contributed a session, and this reflects the cross-faculty nature of NMBU sustainability arenas. The theme of the conference is how we together represent waves of potential to act on climate change. Engaging with climate change means reimagining how we, both as students, researchers, educators, and individuals, relate to the collective, opening up space for transformative action. Today, we will explore how we as individuals become part of collective change and the hope that lies in moving from doomerism to such collective engagement. The sessions have been put together to explore three themes. First, the way forward and communicating climate change, starting with a discussion of COP27. Second, multiple perspectives on what change is needed. Third, how we engage with change. There's time set aside at the end of each block to discuss the issues and perspectives that come up. I'm very excited about today's program and this opportunity to engage with you all on an important topic. So please do engage and participate. Some practical issues: please keep your mobile phones on silent. In the event of an emergency, there is an emergency exit there. This event is hybrid and it's also being recorded. And now, we are very fortunate to have here today the rector of NMBU, Kurt Rice, who will be opening this conference. Kurt Rice has been particularly engaged in NMBU's new strategy as a sustainability university, which was launched very recently. His engagement is a huge support and inspiration as we as students and staff alike grapple with how, in the face of complex global challenges, we can most effectively contribute to shifting development towards a more sustainable and livable future for all. Welcome, Kurt Rice.
Thank you so very much, Siri, and welcome to all of you. Welcome to you who are students here at NMBU, and not least of all, welcome to those of you who are following along on the internet or who have actually come here from other institutions. It's such a pleasure to be in a setting with activities that are really pushed forward by our students. In fact, I would dare to say that the focus that we have on sustainability here at NMBU is in no small part a result of a constant pressure from students who say, you have to do this, we want this, we need to do this, it has to be different. And it is such a privilege to be part of a workplace where every day you meet the idealism of people on their way through their education and out into the workforce. As Siri said, we've just recently done a process with a new strategy here, and I won't say too much about that, but there are two things I would like to say. One is that instead of having a strategy for NMBU and a strategy for NMBU sustainability work, we decided we will have one strategy. Our strategy for NMBU is our sustainability strategy. That has to be front and center in every decision we make, in everything that we do. And that means not only that our educational programs bear the spirit of sustainability and that our research is affected by that, but it also means that the way that we run our organization is affected by sustainability. There's one thing I wanted to share with you, because I know you're partially interested in policy issues, and that's really interesting about trying to promote an institution as being a university focused on sustainability. It's really different than trying to promote a university that's focused, for example, on being a great school of engineering. Because when you're trying to be a great school of engineering, in a sense, you're trying to do that better than everybody else. You're trying to take a position at the cost of some of your sister institutions. But when you're trying to promote yourself and develop genuinely as a university focused on sustainability, one of the things that you have to do is bring everybody else along with you. NMBU's success as a university with a profile on sustainability is in part measured by our ability to get our sister institutions to adopt the same focus. And that's a really complicated and interesting policy type and leadership type of challenge. And I think that some of the topics that are being discussed today are going to touch in on that in very natural ways. I'm so looking forward to this afternoon. I have to be in and out a little bit myself, but I know that you are too. And for that reason, I'll just say once again, welcome everybody, and I wish you a very successful day. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt, for those very inspirational words. With this, I would like to welcome the chair of the first session, Professor Ståle Naveru, who is chairing the first session. He's a professor of environmental economics.
Thank you, Siri. A great pleasure to be here. My role is as a timekeeper. If you heard me lecture, you probably wouldn't have given that job to me. But anyway, timekeepers, that is what the COP meetings need, you know, to keep on track towards the goals of not rising the mean global temperature above 1.5 degrees. So I will skip directly to the first session, the first block, which is named The Way Forward, Communicating Climate Change. And we have a panel. So we have Tomohiro, which is online with us. And then in the panel, physically here, will be Siri, Nisha, and Thea. So that's some of the students that will have organized this. There are more students organizing this. You can see that up on the board there. So please give the floor to you.
Once again, I welcome you all to this conference. My name is Precious, and myself and my group members will be talking about COP27. COP27 is an interesting event when it comes to climate change, and it stands for the United Nations Climate Change Conference. And over the years, there's been like lots of COPs, but this year there was an event, COP27, and it happened in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, and the various topics that were discussed during the conference relates to gender, inclusion in climate change, the topic of loss and damage, and various issues when it comes to finance and all of that. So I would like to, we have distinguished speakers who would be shedding more lights on the topic, and yeah,
So we have 4 panel members, which we are very excited to learn from. First is Siri Eriksson, who is a professor at Climate and Development at NMBU. And we have Nisha Jha, who is a MS student at International Environmental Studies, and who is also a youth activist. And we have Tomohiro Harada, who is a PhD candidate here and also a university lecturer at NMBU. And we have Thea, who have participated in this COP27 as a civil society member with SPIRE coordination of Climate and Nature Committee. So first, I would like to invite Siri to have a significant speech about this.
Okay, thank you. I'll say first a little bit about what I did at the COP. I was at the COP representing the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to communicate findings from our latest report that came out earlier this year. The IPCC is the UN body responsible for assessing the science that informs international policy making, so it's a scientific foundation for the negotiations at the COP. So, for example, we were asked by the Climate Change Convention to present about adaptation needs and ways of assessing adaptation needs for delegates to the conference. A key message that I would take away from the COP and from our work is how we need now to shift towards more climate resilient development. So climate resilient development is a framework for understanding how we respond with increasing warming that we're now seeing. So impacts of climate change, including irreversible changes, increase as we approach and exceed 1.5 degrees. And this means that adaptation and mitigation cannot be seen in isolation anymore, because if we don't mitigate, the warming increases and adaptation becomes less effective. So we can't adapt our way out of climate change is the bottom line. So we need to accelerate both adaptation and mitigation. There's a narrowing window of opportunity to secure a sustainable and livable future for all. So what we need to do now is to mobilize both adaptation and mitigation to advance sustainable development and systems change. And that is a systems change that places reduced risk, reduced warming, enhanced well-being, enhanced ecosystem health, enhanced social equity and justice at the center. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Sri. Anisha, you can start.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Nisha, and I stand for equality, inclusivity, and happiness for myself and others. So before going to COP, I was really scared to unfold the lies behind the extravagant documents that is being shared with all of us, taking from Paris Agreement, the Globstick Agreement, and so many Kyoto Protocol, and so many others. When I was there, I was super overwhelmed with the feeling that it is the most important conference where everyone is waiting for the outcomes, but at the same time, it felt like a trade show for me. It felt like the branding of different organizations, maybe greenwashing or whitewashing. So it was like, where am I? I am the person who believes in climate action. I am the person who believes in action starts and change starts from myself. But at the time when I see the global prominent leaders working in such a slow space, I wished there were timekeepers to tell them that we don't have time. What stays in Pakistan doesn't stay in Pakistan. It might be remembered as the historic UN FCC for the loss and damage mechanism. But as Siri mentioned, without mitigation, no adaptation or loss and damage will work. When we are being overflown in our bathtub, we close the tap. We don't go and look for the mop to clean the water outside. So the loss and damage mechanism, which has been taken as a word, in this COP27, there is no concrete words for this. How will be it? Or who will fill it in? Who will get it? We still have to wait for the whole year, next year, to see how they take it proceed ahead. So a key message for me and everyone was, this should be a great reminder for us to keep fighting before, during, and after these COPs, to vote for the right people, to use our own circles of influence, to do something, anything, and keep fighting the climate crisis. Because we know what we need to do. And we don't need timekeepers to tell us that we are getting out of time. Thanks.
Thank you, Nisha. It was very insightful. Now we will move to Tomohiro Harada, who is in Zoom. He will share his insights with us.
Okay, I unmuted myself. That's great. Well, let me start by thanking Siri and students, of course, for organizing this fantastic and I would imagine a very important event. My name is Tomo, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of International Development and Environment Studies. And my primary research focus is on indigenous diplomacies, which concerns ways and means through which indigenous peoples engage with other people, nations, and states at international level. Personally, I had two mandates at COP27. First is to study and support, when possible, indigenous peoples' participation in global governance, including its organization of work, negotiation and communication strategies, and interaction with parties and other non-party stakeholders. And the second is to hold parties and Norwegian delegation accountable to ensure that the best available knowledge is in diverse forms guide parties' understanding of climate change and decision-making process. And of course, to ensure that the Norwegian delegation is actively promoting ambitious climate policies, which are in compliance with its own national and international obligations. Obviously, the NMBU doesn't give us a specific mandate, but obviously as someone from research community in Norway, it's important that we promote research and accountability. So what does it mean in practice? I have followed the meetings of utmost priorities for indigenous peoples, including the cooperative implementation of market and no-market approaches of the Paris Agreement, loss and damage, and cover decisions proposed by the COP presidency. Seems all complicating, but I hope complicated, but I hope I can explain a little bit more. Under these agenda items, the requirements of indigenous peoples are to ensure that the negotiation texts include robust measures against negative social impacts and stringent environmental and human rights safeguards, participation of rights holders and stakeholders in its implementation, and concrete references to promotion and protection of human rights as a minimum standard in pursuit of the goals of the Paris Agreement. And personally, in many regards, the outcome of COP27 fell far too short of expectation held by civil society and indigenous peoples who expected parties to maintain high ambition while implementing robust safeguards. We know that the parties are falling behind the agreement that had made in Paris to keep temperatures increased to 1.5 degrees, and the ambitions are being chipped away by parties who recognize the urgency and the role of youth, women, indigenous peoples, and local communities in fighting climate change, but are questioning the scientific consensus, privileging economic considerations, and afraid to generally promote human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples and participation generally in decision-making process in order to empower communities on the ground. And obviously, the longer we delay the appropriate climate action, the more the states must resort to the use of unproven and therefore risky technologies with unknown social and environmental impact. And in one of the recommendations, for example, by Article 6 carbon market mechanism proposed was geoengineering, which is starting to, and this type of technological kind of approach to climate change solution is starting to kind of emerge in climate change negotiations. And obviously the concerns of civil society and indigenous peoples are increasingly, is about, how increased ambition without robust human rights safeguards would lead to more rapid and aggressive exploitation of their land and resources in the name of green transition and climate change mitigation. But so I will stop. But I think my key message is that things that I really want to talk about is about the role of observers at COP27. Key message for me is that you can, as students, impact negotiations through opportunities provided to you by NMBU and as an academic institutions, and you can play an important role. So basically what I'm trying to say is that, being an observer is not just about observing. And I really hope that we can discuss more so that you can, if you're thinking about coming to COP, you can participate and not just the COP, but there's also other meetings that might be of interest to students at NMBU. So thank you very much. And I'll stop right now.
Thank you so much, Tomohiro. Now we will talk about COP27. We will hear from Thea.
Yes, so my name is Thea, and I follow the COP as a civil society or a representative from Spire. And we are working on influencing the Norwegian government and also following the discussions and try to influence a better outcome. And I think that I have really, really mixed feelings about the COP. A lot of people are saying it's a failure. And in a lot of areas, it is a failure. For instance, we are way behind where we should be on the mitigation, and the mitigation work program that we got was way too weak in order to reach the 1.5 target, and we even had to fight for the 1.5 target to be in the core decision as it was agreed upon in the Glasgow conference last year. And yeah, the language is also really weak on the mitigation part, but in some areas, you also have like an historical win, which are the loss and damage fund, as you also mentioned, as a part of a lot of different solutions for increasing financial support for loss and damage. And this has been a fight for 30 years, or even more. Like, it's been really difficult for a lot of countries from Global South to have support and to get financial support and get technical assistance and everything for dealing with losses and damages. But as Siri and you also mentioned, we will just see more of the losses and damages if we're not mitigating correctly. And yeah, so even though it's a win with the loss and damage fund, we still, someone called it an empty bucket because it still has to be filled by who is going to pay, who has responsibility, who will receive the money, who can apply for the support and everything. So it's still a lot of discussions left there, the big difficult questions, and also a long way to go on the mitigation.
Yeah, thank you so much. Maybe in this loss and damage, Siri has something to say? Especially in regards of Pakistan and the flooding and the financial ways and how it can be done. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. So I had attended one roundtable on the global stocktake and on adaptation, loss and damage. And the global stocktake takes place next year. It's basically about looking at where we're at with mitigation and adaptation. And the discussion was then, well, loss and damage in adaptation, where should it be in the stocktake? So I think what Pakistan sort of illustrates then with the losses and damages that, are so extreme and existential that we've seen, is this also political split between countries in the south arguing, the losses and damages, they're upon us now, that's in the IPCC report. The losses and damages are due to emissions in the north. This is a global social equity issue. And we need, to be funded. There needs to be a separate funding mechanism for this. Whereas countries, or several countries in the north, focus more on anticipatory action and, future adaptation to minimize risks in future, and saying, well, the mechanisms are already adequate. We just need to coordinate them better and so on. But actually, the loss and damage is a significant step forward, precisely because I think it unlocks a little bit this social equity dilemma. It was blocking mitigation, the fact that there was this, resistance to acknowledging that emissions have created losses and damages. So I'm hopeful that the fact that there is now a loss and damage fund, that will also help progress on mitigation. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. So to sum this up, we are seeing some hope, even though we have discussed that this might be a failure in some ways, but we see our way forward, right? So I think this is our take from this. And with this, I want to end this session. Thank you all, and we look forward to the next sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you to Norshin for moderating and being on time. and for Precious that also introduced the session with the COP27, the way forward. Today, you could actually buy a permit to emit 1 ton of CO2, and it could cost you as little as $1.5. That's in the voluntary emission trading market. For the EU ETS, you would have to pay $78 today to emit 1 ton of CO2. As economists, we know through modeling that the damages of emitting 1 ton of CO2 is at least $200, and that's probably not accounting for, you know, extreme, to a sufficient degree, the extreme events. So, you know, the instruments we're using, the economic instruments we're using to reach the target, 1.5 degree target, is too little. So the next session says, and Mother Earth say, I'm too young to die. So there is a group of students that have organized this also. And so we have Emma and Colin that's coming up on stage. So please, the floor is yours.
How's the patient?
Sea levels rising, temperature fluctuating. The situation's critical, Doctor.
Oh, he's waking up.
What's happening?
You're in an unstable condition. It doesn't look good.
Oh my god, I'm gonna die, haven't I?
No, there is a cure. You'll never get back to where you were, but you'll have a lot of time left.
Okay.
But we need to act now.
Alright, let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah? So, should we get started then, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh,
we
okay.
need to act immediately.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah.
I won't let you down.
Okay.
Doctor, he's burning up. We haven't seen temperatures like this before.
Oh god, I'm gonna die.
No, you're not. Not on my watch.
Will I do something?
Okay, we're gonna do something, right? But before we do it, I need to let you know that this could be incredibly painful.
Okay.
For us.
For you.
Or if not painful, then really inconvenient.
What?
Yes.
Make something happen!
Okay, this is what we need to do. We need to sedate the patient and bring him to the operating theatre.
Yes, Doctor.
Then as I wash up and put on my gown, you sterilize the area and prepare the instruments.
Yes, Doctor.
Then when everything is ready, I'll make my way down to the theatre and I'll ask you for a scalpel. You'll reach over into a metal tray and you'll...
Would you stop talking about what you're gonna do and just do it?
We need to be 100% sure before we act.
Doctor, the analysis has just come back from the lab.
Whoa. This is definitive.
Okay.
It tells us exactly what we need to do. Okay, let's not waste any more time.
Yes, okay.
Oh, Doctor, wait.
What is it?
There's this conflicting evidence.
This changes everything.
No. You're just not gonna do anything, are
We
you?
are doing everything we can.
It doesn't seem like that.
Doctor, Mars is here for their check.
Okay. I'm very sorry, Earth. We're going to have to reschedule.
Why? What's wrong with Mars?
Oh, nothing. It's just exploratory.
Yes. Thank you. I'm not sure how this thing works. Okay. Sorry.
How's the patient?
Sorry. My bad. So, hi everyone. We are climate anxiety and doomerism. First, we want to start with a very short question. How many of you guys are worried about climate change? Sorry, no. Oh wow, everyone. Jesus. Okay. Who is not worried about climate change? I'm not worried. I'm just doing this because my mom said I should. But that's okay still. So about, I think last year, there was a climate survey done for a certain age group, like 16 to 24. And then they asked this kids, how do you feel about climate change? Are you worried? And then these are the numbers that were given. You can see that a lot of them are pretty worried about it. But then when you ask them, okay, you're worried, do you think anything can be done? They're like, I don't know. There's nothing we can do. And then there was now a worldwide survey with a larger age range from 16 to the age of 34 or 47. And then you can see that a certain percentage of people around the world are also not worried, just like I am not worried as well. And that's just statistics.
So yes, I see that we're an anxious bunch in the room, but what is this that we're feeling exactly, and what are we talking about? Well, climate anxiety, this is what we're feeling. It's actually a subset of this more general term called eco-anxiety. And eco-anxiety is a chronic fear of environmental doom, or this generalized sense that the ecological foundations of existence are in the process of collapse. And climate anxiety onward is the sense of fear, grief, and distress linked to climate change. So it's these thoughts and feelings that manifest that there might not be a future for you, your kids, or yourself because of climate change. So you might be questioning, how's the world going to be when I'm an old man or woman? Should I really bring kids into this unstable future? And what causes climate anxiety? Well, it's undeniable that consistently that the latest news about climate change we're often seeing and hearing and then spread all over our social media channels is routinely pretty terrible. And it can easily feel like the bad news never seems to end or trends in a positive direction. I even saw something this morning that was pretty terrible. And especially as the scientific research on climate change develops, it just seems to be painting a worse and worse picture of the climate crisis every day. So how many times have we heard, this is happening faster than expected from science researchers? And our climate anxiety is further inflamed by the unsettling images and videos of this bad news cycle that we're bombarded with. It's showing the most recent climate disaster, another example of environmental devastation. There have already been countless victims of climate disasters, and as the crisis gets worse, undoubtedly those numbers directly impacted by climate change will only grow. And our anxiety is not just tied up in this idea of the collapse of our future world, it's exacerbated by the perceived failures of governments and leaders to adequately address the crisis. And we just heard about COP27, and while there were absolutely many productive and meaningful discussions, it can feel like all talk and no action, or the blah, 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 or the greenwashing, as Greta Thunberg calls it. I mean, this year at COP, there were 636 fossil fuel lobbyists, and while at the same time, a report came out of COP that 2022 was a record-breaking year for emissions. And then we often feel stuck with with individualized solutions to the climate crisis and the pressure to be the answer. We are told to recycle more, drive less, shower less, fly less, and while these are definitely not incorrect as solutions, it shifts the focus from the worst offenders like corporations, fossil fuel companies, and the capitalist class that are largely to blame and seek to continue this business as usual. And in many parts of the world, drastic changes to our lifestyle is not always a possibility in our fossil-fueled society. And the mental health field has been quick to note that climate anxiety is a totally natural response to a world on fire. The climate crisis feels uncertain, unpredictable, and uncontrollable. And our anxiety is in response to the crisis is becoming normalized and even part of our vocabulary, and people are waking up to the reality that the future might be much darker than our present. And it's clear that one way that we deal with this and communicate with this is through memes. But these intense emotions that we feel actually reveal a deep sense of empathy and compassion for the planet and its inhabitants. However, if our climate anxiety is left unprocessed, we can easily slip into doomerism and apathy. We can easily become lost in despair, from which we lose all hope for a better future. It can make us engage in counterproductive behavior that only perpetuates climate change. So doomer messaging obfuscates the reality that we actually can do something about climate change. So we need to see and be a part of the whole picture, but we have to do it all together. Now, climate activism doesn't always make the breaking news headlines in the media, or sometimes it doesn't get the good faith discussion that it deserves. But whether it be climate marches or protests of new pipelines, or most recently the people gluing their head to paintings, or throwing paint in Frogner Park, the climate movement is getting louder in many ways. And people around the world are fighting with their lives. In the last decade alone, 1,700 environmental activists around the world have been killed, and that averages to about an activist killed every 2 days. But just a quick reminder that it's not all bad. I mean, there are more and more innovations all the time that can get us on a path towards mitigation and adaptation happening in all industries. And we are starting to see the nudge, albeit a nudge so far, away from fossil fuels, and we're seeing this more green energy investment around the world. And there is this ever stronger focus on making our societies on pathways to sustainability and climate resilient. And there is this renewed emphasis on turning back towards nature for solutions. And we see, as students of NMBU, we see this all the time. And other people care more about climate change than you think. The same survey Emma was referencing earlier found that 77% said that climate change is important to them, with them asserting, with 63% saying that they believe that climate change is important to the average person in their country. And 58% of the respondents to the survey said they were at least optimistic about our chances of reducing climate change, and they identified to be either strong or soft optimists.
So humanity is at a crossroad between climate disaster and transformation, and we need to be radical. We need to have hope when we're facing climate change. So this cycle of feeling down, stories of doom, explosions here and there, you start to feel like there's nothing that can be done, and then the cycle goes on, and then there's no action, and it just keeps on going down, round and round and round. But if you're feeling optimistic, and then let's say 4 people come together and then they have a solution, what happens? There's stories of hope, and then action happens, and then climate change might be solved. So we have to help as many people on Earth to understand the situation that we are in, and it's important for us as people to be clear-minded so that we can make the best possible decisions together. We can explain, we can inform, we can educate, especially we can act on climate change. So we will leave you with this quote by Greta Thunberg. We need to keep repeating the message on climate change constantly. For hope begins when we open our eyes and swap the importance of words for the power of collective action. Thank you.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you for this message, leaving us with hope. And I think there are a lot of good things that have happened also. Within the EU, there has actually been a 34% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. And even though there is little time until 2030 when it's going to be a 55% reduction, which is their goal, which might be too little, still there is this goal of carbon neutrality in 2050. But I think it's very important to keep repeating the message that you need to keep on track, and that that we will work to get it and not give up. We have the next session, which is reaching out to the public about the climate crisis. And this also will I mean, here we will have, there's the group of students that have organized this. And on the panel, we will have, I think, a very well-known person that have talked about the other big crisis we're facing, the nature crisis. And is very good at actually communicating this. So Anna Sverdrup Tyggeson will be here. And then we have Mina and Randi, the two students that will give an introduction and interview Anna on this. And there is a close link also between nature crisis and climate crisis, although nature crisis is caused, the main culprit there is the land use changes. But still, climate change will of course also affect nature crisis. But I think I'll leave the floor to you, so please.
Okay. Hi everyone, and welcome to our session. As already said, I am Mina, and this is Randi, and we're going to have a conversation about how we can reach the public with Anne Sverdrup Tyggeson. But first, I would just have a short introduction to what nonfiction knowledge is, and then I will have a short introduction about Anne after this. So, sorry, but to reduce the impact of climate change and the impacts they have on our society and our surroundings, it's important to take collective action. However, there are some barriers for this, and one of them is often called climate science, which is a phenomenon that people avoid talking about the climate crisis because they maybe feel like they don't have enough knowledge about it. Because there's a lot of science behind our understanding of the climate crisis and the adaptations needed, but these might not be fully available for the public because it's quite complex and might be hard to understand. But to start a conversation about the climate crisis and increase the public discourse is a really important and meaningful step towards taking actions in our communities. And one example of this is facilitating and one facilitating factor to this is to start a conversation by writing comprehensive literature for the public. And this is why we want to talk to Anna, because she's a professor here at NMBU, but she's also an author that has written several nonfiction books about nature and insects. And the majority of her research focuses on how land use affects forest biodiversity and also the services that forests bring to the ecosystem. And she is especially interested in what she calls the hidden biodiversity, such as insects and fungi, which are some species that we really rarely see and rarely think about, even though they are really crucial for important processes in the nature. And because of this, they are also really important to us as humans. And in 2018, she published a book called Insektenes planet. And in 2019, she published the book Insektenes hemmeligheter. And in 2020, she published a book called På naturens skuldre, which is about how 10 million species save your life, which with the help of examples from ecology shows how nature can regulate, elevate, and repair, as well as how humans depend on other species. So with these books, she has tried to reach out to the public, and this is what we want to talk to her about.
So your interest is in biodiversity studies and insects. How did you discover your interest in this?
I think it started when I was a kid, actually, that I was lucky enough to have, parents and grandparents that actually spent time outdoors with me, showed me that nature meant something to them, talked to me about birds and flowers, and we spent a lot of time in the outdoors. And I think that was what sort of came back when I actually started to study history, and I did that for a while. And then somehow after a couple of years, I realized that this thing with being out in nature, seeing species, could actually be a profession. You could actually study this. So I switched to biology, and I don't think I have ever regretted that. I think it's good to have this sort of mix between, to have this history and also a bit of journalism with me, together with the biology from my education.
Yeah, and what do you think is the role of the biodiversity studies in relation to climate change?
Oh, I think that's super important. Like it was said here, there is a tight link between the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And a lot of the win-win solutions that we could look for are to be found in intact nature, because intact nature with a rich biodiversity will work as a buffer against some of the negative effects of climate change. It will sort of bolster the ecosystem, buffer them. It will make the ecosystems more robust if you have lots of different species that can sort of react to the climate changes. And then you have, it's like you have a bigger toolbox. You have different, some species might then be good at pollinating when it becomes warmer. Other species might be good at pollinating when it becomes more rain, more precipitation. But if you have a depauperate biological society or community, you will lose these opportunities. So I think there's a super tight connection, and this is also shown. I mean, you have talked about COP27 today. In a week, there's another COP starting, COP15, the Nature Summit in Montreal, Canada. And I think these conventions and the COPs in these conventions are working more and more together, pulling more together, like also the IPCC and the IPBES are doing, because it is, in a way, two sides of the same coin, and we need to solve these challenges together and at the same time.
Yeah. So with all of your knowledge, how did you start to write books? What was the, yeah.
Well, actually, starting to write books was because a publisher asked me, but and then it's before that we had started a blog, a sort of science blog called Insektökologene, the insect ecologists, together with a PhD student and a colleague of mine. And there we told all these stories about insects, how fun they are and how important they are in ways that most people don't think about. So when this publisher called me and asked if I wanted to write a book about insects, they sort of wanted a book about what sort of insects do we have in this country, where do they live and stuff. And I said, yes, I do want to write a book about insects, but not that book. I want to write a book telling all these wonderful stories of why insects are important, all the fun stories. So that was what I did, and I don't think the publisher regretted that, because it seemed to work. And also abroad, actually, this first book that you mentioned about insects, which is called Extraordinary Insects in English, it's actually published in 26 languages. So it's really been a way of reaching out to a lot of people in different countries, telling that insects are a lot more than that annoying mosquito.
What are some of your challenges in your work when you're writing books to a wider public?
Maybe to find the right sort of balance between hope and despair, between fun facts and seriousness. Because I think the reason why my writing has worked so well is because I focus a lot on the nice things, the fun facts, but still the underlying message is absolutely serious. And sometimes it's hard to know exactly how much to put on each of those sides. But I often think it's good I think we can work and reach people through enthusiasm and through sort of, let's call it love of nature, fascination for living, for life, for living species, organisms. And if we can do that, often people will ask the questions themselves. how do these species fare? What is happening to insects or fungi? What is happening to the world's forests? And if they ask the question themselves, they will also sort of own the answer a bit more. And in that way, I think, even though I don't necessarily go all the way and tell sort of the sad, all the talk that much about the crisis aspect in my book, I still think that I trigger some sort of engagement in the readers, that they would want to do something about it because they understand that biodiversity is super fascinating and important.
Yeah, and when writing and reading up for writing your books, was there a special fun fact or something that caught your interest?
Oh, there are so many, but I think still one of my favorite fun facts maybe is the horseshoe crab, which is an invertebrate. It sort of looks, it's not a crab, it sort of looks like a frying pan. It's about this big, and it does have like a handle, which is really a tail. It lives in the ocean. And this species has a blood that is baby blue in color, and it has this almost magic way of working. If it gets into touch with bacterial poisons, it will turn into a sort of a sticky mass. And most people don't know that the blood from this crab is actually used to test all sorts of vaccines or other things that go into our bodies, that will come into contact with our bloodstream, to check that there are no such bacterial poisons in this that is to go into our bodies. So this means that this strange creature that has been around on this planet for 400 million years, actually, 400 million years, which is a lot. It has survived 5 major extinctions. It is actually saving our lives by making sure that the vaccines that we got, for instance, our COVID vaccines, are safe. And I think it's fascinating that biodiversity can help us out in that way. And it's also a paradox, because all the 4 species of horseshoe crabs in the world are on the global red list as threatened by extinction. So it's some sort of paradox there. How do we pay back this biodiversity for the help that we get from it?
Yeah. How do you make the message in your book more suitable and understandable for a diverse audience, and not just for your peers in your science?
I think, I mean, my books are definitely not for biologists. They are meant for sort of non-academics, everyone who likes to read non-fiction books. And I think I work a lot on, I try to think, how is this relevant to you and me? Why does this matter in your everyday life? And I think by finding such examples and by telling the amazing stories, I mean, biodiversity is amazing. The connections between all these species, I think that, or my experience is that when people hear about it or read about it, they are, it's a lot of stuff that they wouldn't expect. So people think that biodiversity is boring, but it's not. So it's more about sort of telling the stories, working on maybe metaphors that people can relate to, and show how this is important for our everyday lives, like the horseshoe crab and the COVID vaccine, for instance.
Yeah. And lastly, do you have any tips on how everyone can spread the word in our day-to-day life?
I think it's important to also talk about the nice things and the fascination, because I mean, you just talked about climate anxiety, and there is a lot of depressing news, but still there is no way forward if we are not able to find enthusiasm to work on. So sort of nurturing this hope that things can change, I think that's super important. And I think we can do that by telling each other, also talking with people that are not sort of part of this climate or biodiversity interested group in society about these things. So spread the word and talk about why nature and a livable climate is the basis for all of us, for our civilization and for our lives.
Thank you. And thank you
Thank
for
you.
joining us today.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think the one key message from those of you that have read Anna's books, I think, is what she manages to do is to think that preserving nature is valuable. And I'm not talking about just in economic terms as an economist, but it's valuable and something to preserve. So I think to actually come up with this link between climate change, or advocate this link between climate change and the loss of biodiversity, is very important, and will benefit also the discussion around reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases. So when people feel there is something that's valuable, they want to preserve it, have more of it, and I think that's what the books makes us feel. We're now going from, so one thing is then writing non-fiction books and communicating this. I mean, she's not only writing, but she's also traveling a lot around and giving lectures, communicating this directly. And I think that's also very important. So next session is a transformative art, communicating hope for climate change. Which is, so we are following up on the communication. We have Marte Wolf here, and then we have another Marte that is going to introduce Marte Wolf, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marte, and I'm here to introduce the musical feature for this conference. Our group wanted to showcase how important it is to communicate climate action in multiple ways. So we feel very fortunate to have singer, songwriter, and climate activist Marte Wolf with us here today. Marte has a strong passion for climate action and expresses themes of distress and chaos, but also hope and gratefulness in her songwriting. Since her musical debut in 2006, she has released 7 solo albums and received 2 Spellemann nominations. And she has performed more than 1,000 concerts and festivals, such as Pipfest and Norwegian Wood. She just released her new album called Øya Øye, where she communicates the issues of climate change. And we are all so excited to have her here. Please give a big round of applause for Marte Wolf.
Hi. Very happy to be here. Because my songwriting for the time being is in Norwegian. As for not let the Norwegians not get what I'm talking about or singing about, but I will just, and because of this, tell you a little bit about every song, what it's about, without translating the whole thing. Like she said, I have been just for the last, I think, 5 years working mainly or mostly, almost exclusively on this issue of climate change and nature in my lyrics, and this I used to write, love songs and the regular stuff, and I have said now I'm not writing any more love songs, but it's not true. It's just another kind of love song. So this one is about nature and the love for what we all come from in a way. So it's about the forest and the ocean and how valuable it is to me. I skogen er det stillere i meg. Når jeg spør, får jeg alltid komme inn. Da er det alltid fred. Og i vannet er det tryggere i meg. Når jeg hopper, blir jeg tatt imot. Da er det alltid støtte, samme hvor sterk eller svak jeg er. Du er ikke bare her til pynt. Du er begynnelsen på alt. Du virker inn i hodet mitt. Du er et ansikt og et blikk. Og når jeg har fått for mye av meg selv, for mye har fått sitt eget liv, så er det alltid ensomt. Og da er det gjerne du som minner meg på å kjenne etter hva det er som egentlig betyr noe. Å være til stede her. Du er ikke bare her til pynt. Du er begynnelsen på alt. Du virker inn i hodet mitt. Du er et ansikt og et blikk. Du er et ansikt og et blikk. Du er ikke bare her til pynt. Du er forklaringa på alt. Du virker inn i hjertet mitt. Du er et ansikt og et blikk. Du er et ansikt og et blikk. Thank you. Thank you very much. So it can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge, to make this whole thing to feel personal, because it's very sometimes abstract and scientific. So that's kind of my mission, to try and build a bridge between the science and the people's lives. So this next one is very much about my own life. It springs from a conversation that I had with my 11-year-old. Well, she was 8 at this point, and she was reading the kids' paper about the white rhinoceroses that are extinct, going extinct. There's one type that's only 2 left, she read, and both of them were female. And when she realized what that kind of meant, she just burst out crying like really, really hard for a long time. And I couldn't fix it, really. I couldn't say that it was going to be okay, because the specific thing I could not do anything about. I could only cry with her. So I did, but then it's a sad song, but it is also the thing that I can do, which helps, because I am doing something. I am trying to do something within my field. So that is definitely a comfort. This is called Bunnen faller ut, means the bottom is falling out. And how to explain this. Du det eneste jeg kan om kjærlighet, og det eneste som aldri blir feil. Ingen kommer nærmere, ingen et ærligere speil. Du den som vekker meg om natta, fordi du redd og trenger meg til å roe deg og si at det går over. Si jeg lover. Så hvordan skal jeg forklare at bunnen faller ut, at vi henger i en tynn tråd mens vi ser på at den sliter? Og hvordan skal jeg forsvare at det må ta slutt? Og alt det du har lært å ta for gitt, snart ikke gjelder lenger. Det eneste jeg kan om verdighet, og det eneste som alltid står fast, det bare du som regner med at jeg har kontroll på alt. Du var den som bare ved å være en gang tvang meg til å sitte der og tåle alt jeg hater ved å leve, til det ble bedre. Så hvordan skal jeg forklare at bunnen faller ut, at vi henger i en tynn tråd mens vi ser på at den sliter? Og hvordan skal jeg forsvare at det må ta slutt? Og alt det du har lært å ta for gitt, snart ikke gjelder lenger. Hvordan skal jeg forklare at bunnen faller ut, at vi henger i en tynn tråd mens vi ser på at den sliter? Og hvordan skal jeg forsvare det hvis jeg ikke har tørt? Og alt det du har ventet der, fremtida blir med i fallet. Thank you. Thank you. There's nothing I love more than being allowed to play these songs in front of people who are interested in the same things that I am. It's always very grateful to be here. I'm going to end my musical business with actually this is a cover song that I have made my own translation of for the album that Marte was talking about. It's just very recently released. And it's about, it's released as a vision of the future because I want to make a theater concert and I'm releasing the music first as to just point in the direction that I want to go and then just start walking. And that's also like the message for everyone. We need to envision a place we want to be. It's nice for us to be where we can thrive, and then it's much easier to let go of what is and what is not working. So this is a song that you all, I'm almost 100% sure you've heard it before, only not this particular Norwegian translation. But it's about, yes, daring to think big and dream and having visions for the future and learning from nature. Thank you. Thank you, and good luck with everything.
Thank you, Marte, and Marte for introducing. I think this shows that it's very important that each of us do what we can in our own way. I can't sing, but I can write academic papers. But you know, I wish I could sing my papers, but I can't. So we now open up for a discussion. So I would like to invite Marte Wolf back on stage. Anne, the COP27 panel, And Colin, back to the stage. And Siri. So Pauline here will run around with the mic. So maybe first, I think we have questions for each other. Pretty sure, but maybe just to start opening this a little bit with, if you have questions for us or for the people that have presented so far. This is your chance to make a difference. Remember what I just said about. To warm up, maybe we can I ask any of you if you have some questions for some of the others in the panel? You have a question, so Anna will start. Yeah.
Now it is. Good. I'd like to ask you, Marte, a question. You talk about this vision of seeing where we're going, and I'd like to ask, how important do you think it is to pay attention to, or to put emphasis on this future that we want to imagine, and talk about that compared to talking about the crisis that we are in right now? How should we sort of put emphasis on the two?
Yes, I really feel like both are very important, because my personal experience is that when I realized the gravity, how the seriousness of the situation, it hit me, and I hit the like a bottom. It really affected me emotionally, and I was kind of, depressed. But also that grieving is what made me act. And now I find that only thing that works actually in making me feel better, and also I can see how it works out in the world, that I am doing something within my field, and I want to do what I can so that other people can get that, experience of what how much easier this is to relate to when you are at least doing something. And then it's specifically difficult because there are so many difficult issues, and you can get very stuck in complaining about everything that does not work, and that is bad, and that is, all the suffering. But it also just makes it really hard to look ahead. So I have kind of landed in a place where I want to mainly talk about, I know everything that is not working. I've learned about it, and I know, not everything, but and now I need to concentrate on where I want to go, because it's how I can move, and it's how I can help move other people, and it makes it less scary to move and let go when the place I am going to is a place that I actually think is going to be a better place for human beings to actually thrive and live in and be closer to each other in many ways. That was a long answer, sorry, so I've said mine.
That's fine. Yes, more questions from the audience? Yes, we have one there. Pauline will give you the mic, so please.
Yes, that's on. Thank you for the music. It really brought me into thinking of the sorrow that we go through in all of this. And so I would like to ask the panelists, how do you personally, as we were talking about before, how do you personally process the grief about all this? What are your ways, and we're probably very different, what are your ways of doing that and moving forward towards the future we need to go to?
Yeah, good question. difficult to answer, but anybody? Yes, please.
Because we are talking about grief, as mentioned, but I would also like to mention anger. The anger of young children, young people for the older generation. Because we are like, you didn't do anything. The anger, right? So it is important that we take this anger and grief and realize to take it as an action that we can implement from our personal level. Because for me, it's more anger than grief, maybe coming from the global south scenario, seeing floods, earthquakes, social issues every time. And it's like, you guys are not doing anything right. So it's like taking that anger into principled outrage so that I can explore more for finding the possible solutions, for helping myself, and for helping everyone around. It can be a small action now at the age of, in Nepal, it's after age of 18 that you can vote for right people. And this can be a small solution that we can think about because we know how slow the pace of older generation, from example for COP27 and maybe in coming COP25, we know how slow they work. So we can change by voting for right people. If there are not right people getting elected, maybe nominate them. Did you see the picture that was viral for the 7 women representation among more than 150 people? The COP branding picture. Count your country. Like, was your country sending the woman delegation to be the part of the policy making process? Start from yourself and see the gap and just act for it. That's how I think I can at least go ahead with a happy sleep in the night.
Okay. Yes, Siri you had a comment?
Yeah, thank you for those good thoughts. I think that both grief and anger are represent a deeper form of knowing and a compass for action. It's a compass for us to know what is right and wrong. And hence it is also partly what spurs us into action or spurs us into knowing what action is right. And the second aspect is that we are not alone in our grief and in our anger, and there is a lot of strength in connecting with others in our grief and anger and connecting in action.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I would also say that my best method of coping, one of them, is the outdoors. Actually, the nature is such healing power in my life, anyway. And also, I do not think that I would have gone into this whole thing without having some like a personal practice of meditation or something like that to make me able to take the gravity in and then have many. I suppose also prayer is something for many people, and also, like you said, being with people who are devoted in the same way or interested in the same things, talking about it and sharing it has been the most valuable to me.
Yes, let's go back here.
I think I just wanted to add as well, because I feel one of the most, as you said, that you have to kind of feel some kind of grief or some kind of feelings in order to act upon them. And for me, I think being like studying what a lot of us are studying and talking to each other about these things and looking at solutions, but also being a part of like organizations and everything is really important for me, at least, to feel like, okay, this is like overwhelming and huge and really difficult, but there are other peoples who also want to picture a future that is good to live in, and the way we can get there. So I think being with each other and yeah.
Yes, I think a lot of the important things have been mentioned. For me, it's important to be able to go out in a piece of nature which does not have that much of our fingerprints in it, and just feel this being part of something much bigger than myself. Thinking about how incredibly lucky we are to be right here, right now, in the only little spot in the entire universe where life exists, as far as we know. And also the responsibility that it comes with. But by being in, like in forest, in a sort of a primeval forest, but at least a natural forest, somehow gives me the strength to keep working on these things. It's something happens with you when you're out in nature, I think. You don't need to do that much, you can just be there. And that's a way of filling up with energy and sort of, yeah, restocking to keep moving, as well as being with other people, like several of you have mentioned. That feels the same.
Thank you very much for good responses. And I think in interest of time and my role as a timekeeper, and I see Pauline asking me to stop. So I think I would like to say thank you very much to the panelists here, and also to all the students that have organized all these sessions. So let's give them a big hand for the students.
And I would also like to thank specifically our external speakers. So one of our students has actually made a cookbook that connects with how do we practice sustainability, so in your daily life. So it's a thank you, Marte, thank you for your lovely music. And Anne, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And Sola, thank you for guiding us through this and supporting us.
Thank
all.
you.
So thank you. It's time for a break, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we will shepherd you back in time for the next session.
Hi, everyone. Please be seated. We're about to begin the second session, the second block of sessions of the day. My name is Elina Turbina. I'm a research assistant here at NMBU. And I would like to introduce this block of sessions on multiple perspectives on change. And without further ado, there's going to be 3 different presentation sessions this time, and then a discussion section, just as we did the last time. And I'd like to first introduce our 2 speakers, Peter Aarhaug and Victoria Hedman. And I'm sorry for my pronunciation of Norwegian names. Come on up. Oh dear.
Okay. So I'm Victoria, this is Peter, and we are Group 99. So our presentation is start at the top. Now we're here talking about the bottom-up approach and the value of local knowledge. So when it comes to global issues, we all know this environmental change is a global issue. It happens everywhere, but it doesn't happen everywhere equally. Floods, fires, massive earthquakes and other environmental issues don't affect every single part of the planet equally. So while the issues may be global, the actions taken should be local. Climate change is a very uncertain and uneven thing. We have an agreement as a shared global goal to reach a global warming of less than 2%, 2 degrees, that was set in the Paris Agreement. We're failing to reach that, but part of that is because our perspective is very Western focused. We're focused on the Western world with Western science and technology. So we're focused on a fire in the USA, but what will helping a fire do if there's a flood elsewhere? So we are suffering through something called the Great Derangement. We are thinking that technology and Western science will help save the entire world. It will solve climate change, it will fix everything. But what we're not addressing is the issue with local communities with local impacted areas and how they will be affected. There is a comfort in having a top-down approach. With a global impact of going, yes, the United Nations have come to an agreement, we'll all just do what they've agreed to do. There's comfort because it's adaptable, it's easy to implement, but it is also a top-down approach that doesn't consider lower impacts because we are uncomfortable with things we don't know. We know Western science, we don't know much about indigenous knowledge and much about smaller areas. So the top-down approach is the popular approach. It has many benefits because top-down approach is what we use to solve and what we have traditionally used to solve climate change problems. It's what the Paris Agreement's been settled on, it's what COP's been used through. Agreements with national and international leaders and governors making a decision and then implementing it downwards into local territories. So a top-down approach is designed and deployed for management levels to be carried out at the lower levels, and it has many benefits. It's very normative, it's easy to adapt. Such as the Paris Agreement, every single country, 193 countries and the UN agreed to the Paris Agreement, all agreed, yes, we will do this, because it's normative, it's adaptable, it's applicable across the scales. But a top-down approach doesn't consider issues with relativities and varieties of different settings. It doesn't consider that two places can have the same problem but need different solutions. And one example of a situation where top-down failed is a case with poverty in the Ecuador highlands that was studied by Archetti in 2001. There was a problem with poverty and lack of food, and the solution was then to implement a successful development program to rationalize and effectivize production of guinea pigs. So they did this, they got the locals involved, and it wasn't working out the way they wanted, so they had to send in a team to figure out, to do a cultural assessment, why weren't the locals implementing this project that was supposed to be so successful? And they discovered that the guinea pigs have a significant symbolic, ritual, and cultural meaning in the culture. The guinea pigs hold a significant status. So breeding more of them, producing more of them, wasn't going to solve the problem because the people in the Ecuadorian highlands wouldn't be eating them anyway. They were too special. And so the conclusion was that this top-down approach did not work. It gave them no benefit from the increased effectivity and production because it didn't consider the specific issue this particular area had. The general structure of a top-down approach is it starts at the international level. So in the Ecuador case, it started as an international development program, went down to the agricultural ministry in Ecuador, then down into the local regional government of the Andes, Ecuador, then down into considering the guinea pigs, and then afterwards were the actual people themselves considered. Because the cultural aspect wasn't considered, it wasn't part of the top-down approach. In comparison, in contrast, what we're bringing up as a very important point is the bottom-up approach. Now, the bottom-up approach starts with local and individual action. It's designed to influence policy through behavior. So people working together and then going, we want this changed in the government. And it has many benefits because it's by and for the people. It's adaptive because every area will then have its own people working. So people in Ecuador are working for their specific issues. It's communicative and pluralistic because you will have different areas, different designations and districts working together. Like you can have scientists, teachers, and kids and others working together. There's also interdisciplinary. But it is limited because a bottom-up approach is not equipped to do the same sort of work that a government is equipped to do. It's not equipped to do logistics or the implementation. But a bottom-up approach does consider the local and indigenous knowledge, which a top-down approach often does not. So here is the structure of the bottom-up approach. It starts with local indigenous knowledge and then moves up the ranks of government into the local council, the area, the government, and then on the international scale. But it starts with singular people, singular affected areas. Now I pass it over to Peter.
All right, so we're going to look at some examples. One of the good things with the bottom-up approach is that you can start straight away. So We're going to look to how the elders and aunties of Europe Island, Australia, uses local knowledge to adapt to the challenge of climate change. Europe Island is a fairly small island with around 400 inhabitants. It's on the northeastern shore of Australia, but it faces immense climate challenges, such as increasing extreme weather and increasing floods. The elders and aunties are the honored older generation, which often are looked towards as leaders and people responsible for putting or delivering knowledge from generation to generation. Some of this knowledge is centered around weather patterns, how to predict weather from day to day, but also the longer trends. And what they have discovered and told is that they've seen a drastic change in the environment, in the climate, the past decades. Some other parts of this local knowledge is more practical on how to adapt and build resilience. So what you can see in the pictures here are windbreaks. They give shelter from the increasing intensity of storms and hurricanes. They also help reducing erosions, which are linked to both the storms and the floods. They're made by locally sourced bamboo, drenched in salt water, and it's important to use locally sourced materials for areas like this. They are remote, often cut off from normal transport to the mainline islands. This builds self-reliance, which is very important for resilience in climate change problems. Another example is the revegetation of the coastal shores. By planting native species in sand cays and other coastal foreshores areas, they help build resistance to changing weather patterns. They plant mangroves to help break the waves that comes with increasing storms. The mangroves also works at erosion control, because the island is it's made out of sand, so it's slowly blowing into the ocean when you remove these important plants. So it helps containing the island where it's at. But it's also important for local biodiversity, as mangroves are an important breeding ground for many different species. But perhaps most of all, the most important positive outcome of this is that this is a community exercise. This is something that the whole island participates in, these climate change mitigation activities, such as planting different species all around the island. They found that it has strengthened the community, better communication in between the locals, which in itself increases resilience for the challenges to come. Another such example is from Navdanya and the seeds of Vadana Shiva. So Navdanya, meaning the 9 seeds in Hindi, is a movement to protect traditional agriculture and recover agrobiodiversity. It's made out of a group of farmers, mostly women, who work to collect, multiply, and exchange traditional seeds encompassed with indigenous knowledge on how to use them. The challenges they want to tackle are often related into large-scale industrialized agriculture, which was imported by or with the Western world. The problem with this is that it ignored a lot of the reality of the local communities, the local climate, and the local conditions. The high-yielding varieties that is associated with this industrialized agriculture is often linked and paired with heavy use of chemicals and chemical fertilizers. What they hope to solve with using these indigenous and local-based seeds is to give high yield, but with lower inputs. With inputs such as a normal fertilizer that is available in the area, with creating their own herbicides and pesticides, and using species that are better adapted to the local climate, reducing the need for input of water. Right. What we can take away from this bottom-up approach is that there's a need for transformation. This kind of bottom-up approach privileges local community-based decision-making over the imperatives of multinational corporations. And as a finishing concluding statement, I want to say that local knowledge is and will continue to be a critical element in the process of developing adaptation strategies in a rapidly changing climate. The incorporation of local knowledge in the discussion and the discourses related to climate change can contribute to a holistic development of adaptations that are inclusive, cost-effective, and sustainable, both socially and environmentally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting, insightful presentation, and we will continue in a topic of local indigenous knowledge, and I would like to welcome Florian Opitz and Lily Klein to the stage. Thank you.
Hey, so our topic is Indigenous knowledge in contemporary wildlife management. So yeah, our group has put together a little video to introduce, so you're not just listening to us the whole time. So yeah, I'll let that do the introducing.
Over the last years, the world witnessed an increase of wildfires in scale and intensity. Even the Arctic and other regions that were previously not affected face more and more fire risks. Wildfires impact the world's poorest countries disproportionately, slowing down their development and deepen social inequalities. People's health is directly affected by inhaling wildfire smoke, causing respiratory and cardiovascular impacts and increased health effects for the most vulnerable. Also, the economic costs of rebuilding burnt-down areas are often beyond the means of low-income countries. Moreover, wildfires degrade watersheds and can cause soil erosion that impact waterways. The wastes left behind by fire are often highly contaminated and require appropriate disposal. Climate change and land use lead to a projected increase of wildfire frequency and intensity in the future, with 14% by 2030, 30% by 2050, and 50% by 2100. This is because climate change and wildfires influence each other. Climate change increases droughts, high air temperatures, low relative humidity, lightning, and strong winds, resulting in hotter, drier, and longer fire seasons. Wildfires, on the other hand, destroy sensitive and carbon-rich ecosystems like peatlands and rainforests, making it harder to halt rising temperatures, causing, again, more fire weather. The new UN report, Spreading Like Wildfire, from earlier this year, calls for a fundamental shift in government spendings from reaction to wildfires to prevention and preparedness. Currently, reactions receive over half of the expenses, while planning only receives 1%. The new Fire Ready formula devotes 2/3 of the spendings to planning, prevention, preparedness, and recovery, and only 1/3 for reaction and response. The hope is to make landscapes more resilient to fire through prevention strategies like restoration of ecosystems and controlled burning. Also, there is a need to understand the behavior of wildfires better. A combination of data and science-based monitoring systems, together with indigenous knowledge and a stronger regional and international cooperation, will help with this. In this presentation, we will focus on indigenous local knowledges in fire management, focusing on the case of wildfires in Australia. Like the UN report suggests, this knowledge plays a key role in helping to understand and manage wildfires better, restoring ecosystems, and to work towards strengthening indigenous groups and their rights around the world. We end the presentation with an outlook on how these local and indigenous knowledges can improve fire management also in places where fire has become a problem only in recent years due to climate change and land management.
So long before European colonists arrived in Australia, Indigenous people lived and cared for the country by using cultural land management techniques that worked in union with the environment. Their knowledge of these techniques, their respect for the earth and its elements have been passed through generations through storytelling, dance, and dreamtime stories. To them, fire is both a material and holds cultural importance. It is used for cooking, warmth, ceremonies, and managing their lands. With the arrival of European colonists came suffering, land stealing, and erasure of cultural and cultural practices. The colonizers stopped many traditional practices either by directly prohibiting them or disabling Indigenous people from practicing due to misplacing or removing them from their territories. The practices were not respected or understood, and living with the land was replaced with European farming techniques that were not suited to Australian soil and caused long-term erosion and salinity, which increases the vulnerability of the land to events such as bushfires, which Australia is already very prone to. So the inability to practice cultural land management had deep and long-lasting effects on Indigenous Australians, which can still be felt today. Despite this, Indigenous Australians have found a way to communicate and share their knowledge and continue to practice these cultural land management techniques, such as cultural burnings. And there's now growing adoption in Australia of these practices, and Australian society is beginning to understand that these cultural practices are also sophisticated, sustainable agricultural systems, increasing resilience in the face of bushfires. So I'll just talk now a bit about how this fire management technique works. So in the beginning of Australia's dry season, Indigenous people deliberately set cool fires in a kind of like mosaic pattern. So this pattern consists of interchanging burnt and unburnt areas, and the flames are kind of like kept at knee high, so they're not going out of control. And these controlled burns burn fallen leaves and smaller plants and shrubs, which could otherwise serve as a fuel load in those like bushfire-prone dry seasons. So this prevents outbursts of large, hotter, and uncontrollable fires. It increases biodiversity and carbon sequestration of the land. And the pattern, this mosaic pattern, serves as a fire break, which prevents like wildfires from destroying larger lands. So yeah, it's just pretty much building socio and ecological resilience. Yeah. And the small controlled fires can enhance the ecosystem functionality and create a stronger ecosystem overall. So this is like such an amazing technique, but then we have this problem of how do we integrate this into the management plans? So over the last few decades, local governments have started to reincorporate Indigenous fire management techniques. And the idea to combine these traditional knowledges with modern tools and safety gear to ensure protection of everyone is carried out. So one Australian region that I know does this really well, this blending of knowledges, is the town of Kimberley in northwestern Australia. So here the controlled fires are set in the dry season between March and July, and the region cooperates with Department of Parks and Wildlife, Department of Fire and Emergency Services, and Australian Wildlife Conservancies, so that those carrying out cultural burns receive safety gear, training, and it's safe for everyone. But there are some challenges that arise when incorporating cultural burning practices into Australia's nationwide management solution. So one of them is property rights. Cool burning, or the cultural burning, always needs to be done in accordance with current landowners. Yet in Indigenous beliefs, and the land is originally theirs, there's not this idea of individual land. Like there's no ownership over the land is for everyone. So this, I know in some towns, mine in Australia included, can create some challenges of where can be burnt, like what can't, what's safe, what's unsafe. So I guess like a more flexible understanding of land use and land management needs to be reached so this is effective as possible. Another challenge is kind of knowledge stealing. So in history, most countries that have been colonized, the relationship between Indigenous people and colonists have been one of purely taking and extracting. So in this context, we need to make sure that we do not just take Indigenous knowledge on fire management, but respect it, listen to it, and include Indigenous people in this culturally important practice. So that kind of sums up, the Australia case study. Yeah.
And so the question now is, how can this knowledge aid the world also in other parts in the future? And in order to mitigate fire around the world, like in the Australian case, we have to consider the different needs that other countries and ecosystems might have. Australia is mainly semi-arid, but countries like Norway, for example, and Brazil have very different ecosystems that require an adjusted practice. So Norway's precipitation and temperature has increased and the winter seasons became shorter over the last years. The summer have been drier, causing more bushfires. Only in this year, there have been already multiple dry spells in Norway. In late April, the Norwegian Directorate for Civil Protection warned that there had already been over 500 bushfires this year. This summer, all Oslo citizens were told to reduce water use as the water reservoirs were very low. Resource users like farmers, fishers, pastoralists, foresters, and hunters, they observe and know most about the condition of local ecosystems. They observe the environment around them in the practical day-to-day sense, which is an accumulation of experiential knowledge. These are the local knowledges that need to be incorporated with when using indigenous practices from other countries around the world as role models for wildfire management. So quickly now going again into a different ecosystem with this South America. Studies show that this is one of the most high-risk areas of wildfire, and Brazil recorded the highest wildfire occurrence that South America has seen for the last 15 years. Apart from natural ways of fire, the drivers of wildfires are deforestation and fire suppression policies. Nearly half of the original vegetation of the Brazil Cerrado savanna biome has disappeared, largely due to agribusiness expansion. Fire is associated with deforestation in two ways. Fire suppression policies lead to increased wildfire risks due to fuel load and the increase of sources that ignite fires. So for both Norway and Brazil, there's a need for local knowledges about the land and its biodiversity so that burning practices to mitigate fire can actually work. Local knowledge is unique to every culture and society, so bringing new practices from a different part of the world might not work for the existing ecosystem if not properly introduced or adapted to the local nature and climate. The huge range of ecosystems and their individual needs affect how well new practices can work. Therefore, management of land and fire must build upon social and ecological resilience to contribute towards sustainable development, meaning learning and application must be done in cooperation with each other, in this case, local and indigenous knowledge, and through government encouragement. To conclude with that fire has always played a significant role in the lives of many indigenous groups around the world. although there's little documentation of indigenous people using fire to manage wildfire events, evidence from oral histories and Western science show that many indigenous people actively engage in landscape burning to achieve diverse and varied cultural, social, and environmental objectives, including a reduction in wildfire occurrence. Norway's own government understands the needs for climate adaptation to resist the increasingly changing climate. Since there's no current plan against wildfires because there has not been a need for it, there is a good chance that wildfire management practices from other parts of the world, like the Australian case, can help Norway and their limited knowledge about wildfire mitigation. Then Brazil and the Amazon have, again, very different ecosystems. Therefore, the already existing indigenous knowledge about fire should be implemented into fire management in collaboration with other indigenous knowledges like from Australia. There are growing opportunities for indigenous people and their fire knowledge to be recognized within government policies, practices, and programs. Such opportunities should result in cultural, spiritual, social, economic, political self-determination, health and well-being benefits for indigenous fire managers, their communities, and their land. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, and then the next presentation is going to be on a bit of a different topic. We're now going to listen to Victoria Oppheim and Elizabeth Haugo about food production in a changing world.
Thank you. We know that food production and the food security imposes a large challenge for the future. A report from the United Nations states that the food production is going to have a hard time keeping up with the food demand, not only in the future, but it's something that we are experiencing currently and have been experiencing for some years. As well, we know that the food production stands for a large part of the land and especially the water usage globally, and it's as well one of the main drivers behind the biodiversity loss. We have contacted several actors who we believe plays a key part in finding solutions for sustainable food production in the future. And we asked them 3 questions. What do you think are the greatest challenges with the food industry? Which efforts do you think should be made to make the industry more sustainable? And how do you contribute to making the industry more sustainable? We're going to be showing you a video after soon. And in the video, you will see that a lot of the actors are really good at avoiding directly answering our questions, and they're instead talking around the topic. We believe that if we are going to be able to find good and sustainable solutions for the future, then we need politicians and policymakers to start answering and acknowledging the challenges we are facing. But this conference is also about finding hope for the future. So in the video, we will be showing you some actors to support and some actions you as an individual can take. And after the video, Elizabeth is also going to be giving you some tips for a more sustainable food lifestyle. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video.
Food is our most basic need. Without enough healthy and safe food, people's lives, health, education, and welfare is badly affected. Politicians, business leaders, academics, and the civil society have to work together to transform food systems to become sustainable.
Dear all, thank you for the opportunity to address a few words to you today.
I Mattilsynet tenker vi at både matindustrien og vi i Mattilsynet står overfor flere store utfordringer.
Klimaendringer, naturkatastrofer og krigføring kan bidra til å gjøre det mer utfordrende å produsere nok og trygg mat, og gjøre tilgangen på råvarer mer uforutsigbar og variabel. Disse utfordringene de skaper igjen et stort behov for å tenke nytt om hva vi spiser, hvordan maten produseres, og hvordan regelverket bør utvikles for å møte nye utfordringer.
My name is Pernilla and I am a climate advisor at the Norwegian Farmers Union.
Food security is my #1 priority as Minister of International Development.
We live in a world with huge challenges. Achieving global food security is one of the biggest of them all.
For oss i Mattilsynet det viktig å sikre at en bærekraftig dreining ikke går på bekostning av mattryggheten, og at hele matkjeden tas med i betraktninga når bærekraftige alternativ skal utvikles.
We believe the biggest challenges in the food industry are related to the farmers' wages and how large corporations are taking the power away from farmers. The pressured economy of primary industries is another challenge, so it's an industry that needs change but at the same time has to feed the entire world. The retail chains are pressuring the industry and driving up the increased costs.
Største problemet med matindustri jo at en person skal drive ekstremt stort. Monokulturer skal produsere tusenvis av mål med korn, og det det en person som gjør. En annen ting at det skaper ekstremt store mengder med matsvinn når du sender mat halve jorda rundt for så å spise det her oppe i nord, for at da har de som produserer maten tjent godt med penger på at maten blir produsert i et lavkostland. Matproduksjon kan ikke være global, den må være lokal. Og det vel kanskje et av de største problemene med matindustrien. Den fokusert på fortjeneste og penger, ikke på bærekraft.
To develop sustainable food systems, we need to make all value chains significantly more climate robust. The scientific contributions from your university are important for policymakers and civil society. And together, all of us can make a difference in transforming food systems to end hunger while leaving no one behind.
An important part of the solution lies in the ocean. The ocean is one of our most valuable natural resources and an important source of healthy proteins. Norway is working hard to develop the seafood industry. We want to use more of every single fish, reduce food waste, and make every single part of the industry even more sustainable.
For at vi lettere skal komme fram til kunnskapsbaserte, gode og trygge, bærekraftige løsninger for fremtiden, så jeg overbevist om at god dialog og tett samarbeid mellom aktørene i hele matkjeden, forskning, utvikling og forvaltning bare blir viktigere.
For the food industry to become sustainable, the most important actions include switching to green energy, such as electricity and biogas, better use of resources such as longer expiration dates, less food waste, and improved packaging. Fair pricing of produce is also important, as well as strong cooperatives for the farmers. And it must be profitable to be sustainable and climate friendly, because the farmers have to be able to make a living and at the same time provide us food so that we can maintain food security.
Mat og industri to ord som ikke henger helt på greip, mener jeg. Mat bør egentlig ikke være så industrialisert, ikke hvis det skal være bærekraftig i hvert fall. Med en gang du industrialiserer noe for mye, så minker verdien av det og bærekraften i det. Det handler ikke om at man ond som vil tjene penger på mat, matvaregigantene for eksempel, men det handler mer om distansen mellom folk og matproduksjon, altså man ikke helt vet hva som ligger bak det å skape mat og rike økosystem. Når under 1% av Norges befolkning produserer det som skal være essensielt for at vi skal overleve, da det egentlig krise. Det veldig krise. For at vi skal nærme oss bærekraftig, så må flere mennesker gjøre mer selv. Vi må reise mindre og dyrke mer mat. Eneste måten å gjøre noe med dette på forbrukermakten, matkunnskap, tradisjonskost tradisjon av en grunn. Vi må se på hvorfor det det. Viktigheten av beitedyr og landskap og økosystemer viktig å lære barn og unge. Mer matlaging og dyrking i skolen vil skape en forståelse. Burde norsk mat kanskje være momsfri? Det dessverre penger som motiverer. Reko og bondens marked et godt alternativ, Men her må vi endre folks oppfatning av hvor viktig mat og ernæring slik at det å kutte ut og gå på Kiwi 3 ganger I uka, mot å ta en storhandel 1 gang I måneden på Reko, kanskje viktig for helheten og for helsa.
This month, we are launching a new strategy for food security. NMBU has contributed to this strategy, and as always, I'm grateful for insightful advice I get from us. A main goal in our strategy is to have climate-robust food production by smallholders and to develop local value chains and markets.
We can maintain food security, which are all points that we elaborate on in our climate action plan, where we aim to reduce emissions by 5 million tons of CO2 equivalents by 2030.
Vi gjør matindustrien mer bærekraftig ved å unngå matindustrien. Vi selger alt vi produserer selv, uten mellomledd, rett til forbruker, helst så lokalt som mulig. Da har maten høy holdbarhet, og den har høy verdi, både ernæringsmessig, og fordi at de som kjøper maten av oss, de har et ansikt til den maten de kjøper. De stoler på oss, og maten får verdi fordi de vet hvilken jobb som ligger bak. Vi bruker minimalt med innsatsmidler, ingen kunstgjødsel, ingen sprøytemidler, ved å være mest mulig selvforsynt og uavhengig av eksterne faktorer. Det helhet og samspill I alt vi gjør, slik får vi ekstremt mye mat på liten plass. Vi produserer frukt, bær og grønnsaker I samspill med dyra og det rike økosystemet. Naturen vet best, så vi prøver å etterligne den så godt det lar seg gjøre. Stikkord som flerårige vekster, jordhelse og regenerativ drift viktige punkter. Roterende beiting av dyrene essensielt, det også slik det I naturen. Og vi mener at dyra skal være med I en helhetlig drift for å få landbruket og jordhelsa og økosystemet til å vare I et evighetsperspektiv.
Thank you for sharing knowledge and experience so that we can find the right balance between protection and production. It is vital because nothing is more important than the ocean. With that, Raj, I wish you good luck with today's conference and thank you for your attention.
Okay, so how to be sustainable in personal economy and health also. We have some ideas for how you can eat better without emptying your pockets. So the first one is spices. Dried spices, they last for a long time and they can turn low-cost veggies into fantastic meals. You can use way less meat than what many recipes require when you use more spices and swap meat with, for example, grated carrots, boiled quinoa, lentils, and more. Do not buy the spices at Kiwi, but at a shop where they have more to choose from, better quality and better price. The next one is containers. Make sure you have a lot of boxes in similar shapes with lids for storage of food in the fridge and freezer. From your leftovers, you can create a leftover tapas and make use of everything. You can also prepare your lunchbox with leftovers from dinner. The third tip is to buy dried legumes like peas, beans, and lentils and boil them in a large pot and freeze in small containers. This is much cheaper than buying already boiled legumes, and it's less weight and volume during transport. Use seeds to grow sprouts and other microgreens inside during winter and get almost free superfood. Besides, it's really easy and it's fun to see them grow. Compost. So make compost of your food waste and grow new food in it. As Ron Finley said when he talked about urban agriculture in a TED Talk, growing your own food is like printing your own money. The easiest way to make compost if you live in an apartment is to use the bokashi method. And then follow the seasons. You can buy bone and meat of game and local grazing animals in autumn and keep in the freezer. In that way, you get different parts of the animal and more healthy meat at a better price. Also, you can swap exotic fruit and vegetables with local when they're in season. They taste amazing and they're cheap when they're in season. The most important tip is saved for last. It's to do food prep once a week. When you food prep, you make sure you're stacked up with lots of yummy, nutritious food and save a lot of time and money. Just imagine the numbers of money we use when our blood sugar is low during the weekdays and how easy it is to buy something ready-made when we haven't prepared ourselves. So that's all for us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Now it's time for a little discussion, which is why I made you stay. And also I would like to ask all of the other presenters to come back up on the stage. And I hope that you have questions prepared because we want them. I'm unsure about the microphone situation. There's one on the table, great. So that will be passed around. I think you can just stand a bit closer there. Yeah. Great. Yes. Great. Is there anyone who would like to start off this discussion session? Just raise your hand. Yes, please. And then you afterwards.
Hi, this is a question for those of you who had about the fire management and indigenous knowledge. I was wondering if you've, during your researching this, if you checked out the local Norwegian indigenous people, the Samis, if you asked them if, or found out anything about their fire management.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I have to say that we didn't look at that in very much detail. I think one part that we said is that everybody who works in and with nature knows the most, and with that, the Sami are, of course, mentioned as well. But yeah, I have to say that there was no time to dive more into that. We focused more, I think, on the Australians and how they, yeah. Mm.
Yeah, so I can just add a bit on that. So the reason we chose the Australian case, you might tell from my accent, I'm from Australia. And one of my good friends back home is a First Nation Indigenous woman. And so through that, I know more about fire management in Australia from her first-hand knowledge. And as we mentioned, I think I mentioned in my part, a big thing with Indigenous knowledge is not to extract just knowledge. So it was important for our group members in when we were working to also have some conversations with people who knew firsthand more about it. We knew a bit more about Australia, so that's why we focused more on that.
Yes, please.
Thank you for an interesting panel discussion. I have a question regarding indigenous knowledge in seed. And also, as we can see, the native seeds and local seeds are being lost in very rapid pace. We don't know how many seeds are lost in a given season and when we move to the next season. And I think it's the similar scenario for indigenous knowledge also. Now we know many indigenous people are in verge of extinction, and we don't know how much knowledge and how much source of information that we are lacking in this fast-pacing internet world. So my question is, how can we safeguard those knowledge and those seeds that are being extinct, in verge of extinction, so that we can utilize those knowledge to tackle climate change, to create a resilient community, to move forward towards the future, so that the future generation can know that this knowledge and these seeds and these natural resources safeguard our future.
Yes, who would like to respond to that? Yes? Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's a great question. I think that if we fully understood how to do that, that would be great, but I'll give you like two approaches. So what I would say from the bottom-up approach is that in the local area, you should look towards those people who have been there the longest and start with asking them questions and relying on their knowledge. Another approach would be from the top down, say that government would take more responsibility in seeking out those individuals and trying to map out that knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. And then there's a question right in the area.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this very nice presentation. I wanted to tag along to that sort of discussion about top-bottom, and even sort of zoom out a little bit from that, because I fully agree with you that what we sort of talk about as local or maybe better situated knowledge as something super important. But I just wanted to, what came to me was this, maybe this whole idea about a bottom and a top and a hierarchy there in between, and that we understand us as more or less being on the bottom, I suppose, that in itself might be part of the problem, that we think that we are at the bottom and there is some sort of top, and the top is obviously above us then and in power somehow. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting concept, and that's also what comes up in lots of discussions about bottom-up approaches. Because what we've seen in a lot of cases is when we talk about top-down, bottom approaches, mainly what we're trying to discuss is where the governance comes from. Is it coming from top of government trickling down the hierarchy, or is it going up? But it is an interesting proposition because it does then assume that the government is more worth. So what's popular in becoming popular in top-down, bottom approaches is trying to set it up more as like an international versus local knowledge, like setting them up to work together. It's not just trickling down or going up. We are working together. It's just you cannot have only governmental decisions or only local decisions. Does that answer the question?
Thanks you for that reflection. I guess it wasn't really a question, it was just sort of what is this sort of idea about a top and a bottom doing with our way of understanding, and also to our idea of our own agencies.
So I think I can elaborate somewhat on that. So I think the most important part is to not let you be bound by those principles. So for you as an individual, you should not think that because local knowledge is important, you can only act within your sphere, and if there's nothing to do, then you sit complacent. I think it's important, and even though, so say that you are engaged in something abroad that could be, from the outside perspective, easily be defined as a top-down approach. I wouldn't want you to be hindered by that. I want you to not think of it as much as who can do what, but when you're doing something, you should try to consider the area that you're in.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? Yes? Oh my God. All right. So they're starting up front. Okay, then there's three. All right.
It's just a quick comment.
Yes, great.
To elaborate a bit. I think often what you see the differences between, well, say indigenous knowledge and our more scientific form of knowledge is that typically within the indigenous sense of making sense of what is going on, they see these elements in relationships. Whereas in the scientific world, or the northern Western world, we tend to see things as distinct individually. And then you sort of contrast, well, this element to this element. Whereas in the indigenous world, it's the relationships with everything. What we talk about, for example, in biodiversity, is the quality of these relationships and the causality is produced by these relationships. So even in the context of thinking about, well, top-down, bottom-up, the relationship between these. How the bottom up maybe affects the top and the top affects the bottom, but the relationships as these incorporate these approaches together as well. Yeah.
Yes, then there was a question right there, and then there will be a question somewhere back there.
Well, I'm changing the topic a bit because I want to go back to the food production. You mentioned some actors where you can buy food locally once a month, right? Have you come across any other examples in Oslo where we, as people who live in Oslo, can go to purchase our food locally grown as well?
Do you hear me now? Yeah. So, you know Reko-ringen? So that's quite often. And then I think there are some farms that you can go to. But actually, I haven't found that many places in Oslo. I've been looking for like some market gardens and stuff, but there's no one, as far as I can tell, in Oslo yet. I can't come up with anything else right now. I don't know if anyone else can.
Well, there's quite often you can go to Bondens Marked, a farmer's market, and then not necessarily locally supporting farmers, but you could also, for instance, buy food through To Good To Go to help reduce food waste. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Please.
Hi, so first of all, thank you for your presentations, and I would like to change the topic back again to the indigenous people. So actually my question is, like, all over the place we see like indigenous people threatened by like other people, like let's say, for example, a rainforest destruction. So what is the efforts on preserving like the life of those indigenous people and also their knowledge? So like how can it be achieved to preserve that knowledge and actually make use of it?
Yeah, one of you has a microphone, then yeah.
I can, hello, yeah, I can talk again about the Australian case. So yeah, in Australia, there's very much a feeling that not enough is being done. Through primary school, secondary school, we weren't taught about the local knowledges, the diversity of the culture, and important like landmarks. So for example, in my town at the moment, they're building a new highway, and the town planners just planned the highway, yeah, like gave it the check of approval without actually checking what areas it was crossing. It's actually crossing a very important area, these sort of rock pools that is very important and sacred for birthing Indigenous women. And it's a very sacred, special place that isn't so well known about because they want to keep it sacred and special. So yeah, I guess I'm not answering the question, but just reconfirming the thing that at least I feel like not enough is being done. And I can see a link between also not being educated well enough in school systems about what should be done, what are the practices, what is the culture, and how do we protect that? Yeah, that wasn't really an answer, sorry.
There's another person that could maybe chime in.
So I have an example. I studied my bachelor's degree in Canada on Prince Edward Island. Now, Prince Edward Island is predominantly Mi'kmaq territory, which is Indigenous territory. And they used to have a residence school on the island, so a lot of knowledge was lost due to several generations of Mi'kmaq straight up being killed. So what has been done by the government and by the Mi'kmaq population is they've established a council that writes down all knowledge, all the oral histories of the Mi'kmaq people, special areas, the language, it's all being copied down, and the Mi'kmaq Council has full control over recording their own history. So the Mi'kmaq Council publishes books, it publishes young Mi'kmaq authors, it publishes their living history as it is. And you can find that in any of the bookstores in Canada. They are fully published and available. So that's just one example. It's not very great. They're not doing it unanimously across all of Canada, but particularly Prince Edward Island is working very, very hard on preserving Mi'kmaq knowledge.
Yes, thank you. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions if anyone wants to chime in.
There is a comment on Zoom, which I can read. I don't think it really is a question, but feel free for the panel to comment on that. Bottom-up approach is great, but needs proper frameworks to effectually realize its objectives and ensuring comprehensive involvement of indigenous communities. In Africa, the case of Kenya, where I am, or this person on Zoom, this approach has been used as a campaign tool to influence votes for politicians with the promise of involvement of poor people in state decision processes, but the real underlying issues around it remain unresolved as indigenous communities are not substantially involved in governance processes. This situation calls for comprehensive policy frameworks and governance models that ensure involvement of indigenous communities and integration of scientific and indigenous knowledge. Is there any comments from the panel on that?
Like, we agree. We have no comments. It's very fair and legit because the bottom-up approach does need more structure to it, but it did start sort of a form of rebellion of being like, this is my knowledge, you will hear me. So it does need to be, it has been from what it started as to now, it has become more and more of a framework and more of a structure, but it does need to be more substantially structurized to be better acknowledged and legitimized by governments.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your answers. This is a very interesting session and discussion. We are nearing a break, another 15 minutes or something like that. And then we'll be back at 14:40.
Thank you, and I would like to offer a small thanks to our chair who have guided us through a very interesting discussion. So thank you. Please cook sustainably from now on.
Always will.
Hi, sorry to interrupt your coffee and cake, but it's time to go back to our wonderful seminar. My name is Roberta Cucca, and I am associate professor in LANSAM. I teach sociology. I'm extremely excited to be here, and my duty is to introduce the third block, engaging in action. I think here you are already very much engaged, and this is very nice to see. So let's say that we have two very nice sessions. The first one is about heat waves, climate change, health, and adaptation. Yes, I think we always are worried, of course, about the implication of climate change for the future, but in your presentations, we have already understood that the current implications are already extremely tough, especially for some population. And I think this session will be extremely important to focus again on the current implication of climate change. And the second session will be on how to deal with climate change from an economics perspective. Again, we have understood that if we want to tackle the problem of climate change, we have to do something to change our system of economic production. So also this session is extremely crucial. But I leave the floor to Kiki, who will introduce our guest, Shilpa Rao, and she's a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Public Health, but I leave the floor to Kiki.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. My group, we wanted to focus on climate change and how that impacts health and all the challenges we stand in for that, and how we should adapt. So therefore, we have invited Dr. Shilpa Rao, She's a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, working at the Department of Air Quality and Noise in the Division for Climate and Environmental Health. She has over 15 years experience on the modeling of energy systems, their impacts on health, and policy relevant research related to climate change, air pollution, and health. She leads a number of projects related to climate change and health at the NIPH, and she will now present a short talk on the impacts of heat waves on health and the effects of climate adaptation. We are very glad that you take your time to come here and share with you your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Kiki, and it was a pleasure to be here. I came in already at lunch, and it's been a number of interesting sessions. I'm very happy to be here and see some old friends as well. So I'm going to be talking, I was asked to talk about heat waves, climate change, health, and adaptation. It's probably a very strange topic on a cold day today in November here in Norway to be talking about heat waves. Not something you would ordinarily associate with Norwegian weather, but I will do my best to present an overview of heat waves and what adaptation can do for that. So the recent heat wave is the new normal, says the World Meteorological Association. So heat waves are here and have come to stay. I don't know, this is a very international audience in this group, so maybe I can ask how many of you have experienced a heat wave or been in very hot conditions recently? Can you raise your hands? So there are a lot of us who've been in different countries, traveling for work, traveling outside Norway, or come from places which are very hot. I was in India this summer, and as you know, India has experienced an extreme heat wave along with Pakistan. And I was actually in the south, which is not so hot, but I traveled to the northwestern part of India to see some friends, and it was hot. It was close to 50 degrees, and it really diminishes your body capacity to cope. But there are a lot of efforts being made, and I have a picture up here from Gujarat where I was, where there's an entire solar village. So the entire village was powered by solar energy. So you can see that they talk about solar parking and so on. So it was very interesting to see that there are some efforts being made already on the adaptation and mitigation front to try to combat heat waves. So how is climate change connected to heat waves? I mean, heat waves have always been there. For those who come from tropical regions, we come from regions that are very hot. But what has changed in the past few decades is climate change. So climate change has significantly has made heat waves much more frequent. And some extreme events, they say, would not have been possible without climate change. And the recent evidence is that the heat wave that would occur once in every 10 years before global warming started now occurs 2.8 times as often. And under further global warming in the future, heat waves are expected to become much more frequent. And that's a figure of the heat waves that was seen in, I think it was 2022. And you can see here all the parts of the world that experienced extreme temperatures. So you have Australia, you have India, you have various parts in Africa and so on, which experienced extreme temperatures, temperatures that are almost impossible to live under. So we are seeing heat waves and they are here to stay. What I will do in this talk is just give you a brief introduction of how to define heat waves and their impacts on health. I will tell you about adaptation to heat waves and what's out there, and a very brief introduction of some of the challenges associated with adaptation. I will also briefly talk about some projects in Norway that I'm leading, which also consider heat waves. So just to tell you why Norway is important in understanding heat waves. And then I have a conclusion. So how do you define a heat wave? The definition is actually quite complicated. And that last point is perhaps the most important. There is no clear definition of a heat wave. The meteorological associations over the world all have their own definitions of heat waves. So some people say that it is a period of 5 days. So if you have 5 days that is above the normal temperature, that is called a heat wave. In other parts of the world, for example, in Denmark and in Sweden, it's 3-day temperatures that are measured. So you look at 3 days and you say if the period of at least 3 consecutive days, of which period the average maximum temperature across more than 50% of the country exceeds 28 degrees centigrade, is called a heat wave in Denmark. whereas this would mean nothing in India. 28 degrees is not really a heat wave in India. The Norwegian Association has now released a new definition of heat waves, and this is actually something we have been asked to look at whether these heat waves actually produce any significant impacts on health. So I'll also briefly, this is a very initial analysis that we have done, and I'll show you some very brief results that we got from that as well towards the end of the presentation. And they say that a heat wave in Norway, they did not want to use the Danish definition, so they came up with their own definition of heat waves, which is actually very complicated. It has to be 28 degrees during the day for a period of 5 days or more. In addition, the night temperature has to be 16 degrees. This is quite difficult to realize in Norwegian climate. If you have 5 days over 28 and a night temperature of 16 degrees, is actually not so feasible at the moment. But they think this is a good definition of heat waves. So often these definitions are made by scientists, meteorological scientists who have no connection with health. They don't quite know if these definitions actually impact health. And qualitatively, actually, India has the best definition. It says heat wave is a condition of temperature which becomes fatal to human body when exposed. So basically, you experience a heat wave and you don't feel good about it. You know, you end up in the hospital. That's a heat wave for you. So it's basically when your body reacts to the outside temperature. So basically, that's just all the talk of heat waves. There's no actual definition of what a heat wave is. I'll go very quickly through the slide. I'll come back to it later. But urban areas, as you know, experience more heat waves than rural areas. So urban areas have a lot of cement, have a lot of bitumen involved in their building structures and so on. And so generally you see that urban areas heat up more. And this is called the urban island effect, for those of you who are familiar with it. In general, urban areas are way hotter than the surrounding rural areas. So how do heat waves impact? So basically, first going a step back and talking about the impact of climate change on health. Climate change is associated with various health impacts. There are, of course, heat-related illnesses and deaths. There are also other types of impacts from climate change. You have migration, you have malnutrition, you have a lot of infectious diseases that a lot of scientists work on, including cholera and so on. You have a lot of respiratory disease, and then you have a lot of insect-borne diseases, vector-borne diseases, malaria, dengue, all of which can also, you know, in a country like, I was at a presentation recently, and there was a student who was looking at impact of malaria in Nordic countries. So she is looking at how future climate can impact the incidence of malaria in the north. So it's quite interesting to think also that infectious diseases could become quite important here. But I won't be talking about that because that is not my specialty, but I will be talking more about the direct impacts on health. You have direct impacts which are related to dehydration, related to heat stress. You have accelerated death occurring from respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, and so on. And you have, of course, hospitalization. You may not die, but you may end up in the hospital due to these very causes, and also heat stroke. You also have indirect impacts of heat waves, and there are various impacts that have been detailed in the literature: impact on health services, increased risk of accidents, increased transmission of food and vector-borne diseases, and potential disruption of infrastructure. So various direct and indirect effects that are connected to heat waves. And how does heat affect your body? Very briefly, I'm not a doctor here to talk about heat wave impacts on the body, but what happens is that when you have a heat wave, you have an increase in your body temperature, which is followed by an increase in the heart rate. And here you can see a picture for those of you who have medical backgrounds or want to look at this closer. You know, you can see that heat wave definitely impacts your body. And the heart has to beat harder. When there's a heat wave, you have extreme impacts on your heart, and you also sweat a lot. And all this in combination means that if it's extremely hot outside, you most likely get a stroke. And if you have a cardiovascular risk for cardiovascular or respiratory disease, that also gets worse because of heat. So what has been the impact of heat waves? Well, there have been various burdens that are being estimated at the moment, but this is the impact of human health in the EU and in the UK. And you can see that with every degree rise in temperature, there will be an increase in the heat wave episodes. And you can see here with the one, so currently you have about 2,700 deaths happening because of heat. And with a 1.5 degree temperature, this increases. And with a 3-degree temperature, which is the highest, this goes up to 90,000. So you have 90,000 people who could die because of heat waves. And there are various factors explaining, this is a infographic from the EEA, and you can see that there are various factors that affect these kind of heat waves. You have the north-south divide, you have the urban heat island effect, which I talked about earlier, you have vulnerable people, people who are specifically vulnerable to climate change, and then you have adaptation options, which is what this session is supposed to be about. So there are various things that will influence the future impacts of heat waves on health. Now, who is most affected by heat waves? I wanted to have the opportunity to present a couple of videos here.
I am so hot and so miserable on the warmest days of the year. I just had to find a solution to this. I used to do like this, but the milk got sour. Then I made something else. In 2018, I got a heat stroke. Ended up in the hospital. I was dehydrated, they said. But that won't happen again. It's not the most effective, but it sure is pretty. This is a really good one. I just pump it a couple of times, and then I can have shade from the sun and a little cool spray when I need it.
Just very short.
Climate change. That's something in the atmosphere, in the air. Melting icebergs, prolonged drought. I never thought I would feel it inside of me. But it's fun to find solutions too.
So that's a classic example of adaptation at a personal level. I'm not going to show you the next video. No, it's fine. I don't need to show it in interest of time. But those of you watching the Qatar Football World Cup should be aware that there are a number of protests against Qatar, basically for the migrant workers that they employ, who are employed outside. And there have been a number of migrant workers, especially from Nepal and India, who have died due to the extreme work that they create, and they don't have good working conditions. So a number of people who are affected by climate change, the elderly, the children, migrant workers, so there are a number of, also to think about, when you think about adaptation, you have to think about all these different communities. And here again, I'm going to go fast. This is just a slide to show you the poorest communities of the world. And basically, it's the same story. The South is more affected than the North. You have a lot of people in the South who are more affected. Of course, the Southern, in the global South, they live closer to there always been hot conditions there. But climate change just means that the number of these conditions have increased greatly, and they do not have the capacity to cope with them. So we're talking about adaptation. What is adaptation, basically? Adaptation is the things that we do. So like you saw the slide before, what the old lady was doing, and how it affects human health and well-being. And what we do can be at various levels. It can be at an individual level. It can be at a government level. So there are various levels in which you can adapt to climate change. And I'm not going to be talking about mitigation, although it's probably the bigger part of the problem, but I'm not going to talk about that at this point. How do you adapt to heat? So as we saw in the previous slide, there are, of course, personal measures that you can take to adapt to heat. But there are also bigger measures that come out from the government side, where you can have emergency services, for example, which are provided to you, which tell you that it's going to be a hot day. You also have urban green areas, which have been discussed in the literature as being an important part of responding to climate change. You also have a number of building structures. So buildings can be constructed better. Air conditions are something that you buy to cope with increasing temperatures. But buildings and building structures can be created quite differently to allow cool air to come in. And this is something that's being extensively discussed by the building industry. And I just got an email yesterday from somebody in the building community who wanted to know what he can do about climate change. Somebody was writing an article about it. So there's more and more interest in how you can adapt to climate change, adapt to heat waves. And of course, all adaptation measures are not so straightforward. They may produce an impact on your health. They may improve your health. But there can be other kind of effects. So if you have green areas in cities, but you don't think about the green areas that you are planting in the cities, you could get, for example, increased allergic diseases. You could have pets who don't cope very well with that. You have a number of animals that could appear because you have the wrong green areas in the city. You could get obscured views if you have buildings that don't allow you to look outside. So the number of negatives from an urban design point of view, the number of negatives that come with these things. There are also a number of indirect effects. We all switch on the air conditioner because it's hot for 5 days in Norway. That's a huge burden on the electricity system, and the electricity system basically collapses. There are also as I said earlier, there's also the equity and the equality aspects related to adaptation. They need to be able to serve all the people equally. And there's a lot of literature on this. What is a climate just world? How do you make adaptation beneficial to all communities in the world? So I'm not going to talk much about that, but this is actually a huge debate on how do you ensure that climate adaptation reaches the people that it should reach. There's also the economic aspect, which again, I think is going to be taken up in the next presentation. So I will also skip that. I will now very briefly talk about some projects that we are working on and why it could be beneficial to also include Norway in the analysis. So I'm heading a project, or at NIPH, I'm heading a project which is related to exposure to heat and air pollution in Europe. It's a Horizon project, and they include Norway because it's quite important to also look at the north and the south. When you're looking at temperature changes, to get a good perspective for Europe, you need an entire picture. And I think what we have, so this is basically the framework of the project, which again, I will not go into great detail, but perhaps what is, and why is it important? Because you can see in this slide that you have increasing temperatures in Norway in the future. So if you see here, the red lines are basically the increased temperatures in Norway in the future, and temperature is going up. It's not going up perhaps so dramatically as you would think, but temperature is going up, which makes calculating the health impacts related to these temperatures more and more important. So this is my last slide, or almost my last slide. There's actually a sub-project which investigates the health impacts of heat waves in Norway. And I said this is a very initial analysis where the Meteorological Institute asked us to take their definitions of heat waves and see whether there are any significant health impacts connected to that. And it's very preliminary analysis, but we find that yes, there are health effects. Even in Norway, if you look historically at data, there are not that many heat waves in Norway, but there have been some effects, and we see that the effects tend to be higher in women and elderly people, which is quite interesting to see. But when you have an adaptation perspective, it should take these groups into account. So that's something very interesting, and we're working more on looking into that. And I think still there's a problem in Norway. We also had a set of interviews in another project that we're working on how Norwegian policymakers think of adaptation. And it's the same as we heard earlier. There's a lot of debate on it, on adaptation, but there's no real kind of, they want to do more, but they're not sure how to do it. So there's been a lot of events on that, and focusing on the health impacts of climate adaptation is still very, very limited in the Norwegian policy community. But there is a lot of interest. We have been contacted by various policymakers, so this is something they want to build on in there. I think that's it from my side. That's my final slide. 3 frogs in water, and they still don't know what to do. One of them was measuring the temperature, another says he doesn't feel anything, and the third says he's an alarmist. So this basically sums up the world we live in. And what I found very interesting, when I was looking for this video on Qatar, I went on the net to find this video, and what I found very interesting is that heat waves are now actually in popular culture. So if any of you have time, please look up this video. This is actually a video which is called Heat Waves, and it's an entire, I think it's an Australian song, I'm not sure, but it's an entire song on heat waves and the effect of heat waves on a person and their health. So please look it up, because I was quite surprised that now it's even a part of our popular culture in there. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I'm very glad to introduce the next presentation. We have here 2 students from the School of Economics and Business at NMBU. So I'm very glad to leave the floor to Elise and Sophie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Does it work? Oh.
All right, I'm Elise and this is Sophie, and today we are going to talk about how to deal with climate change from an economic perspective. Because we must reduce emissions, but at what cost? So today we will talk about first how to reach optimal emissions reductions, thereby abatement, and how to reduce these emissions.
Okay, so first we go to the notion of optimal emissions, because it might sound a bit counterintuitive. We all know that emissions cause damage. Climate change is costly. But are there also benefits of emissions? Why are we doing this in the first place? Well, the answer is simple. It's profitable to do so. The products we make using CO2 with emissions, they give us value. They have value in our economic system, and that also means that stopping doing that is costly. This is why economics, of course, would say it's not necessarily optimal to just cut down emissions entirely. We can find an optimal point of emission level. So the question then becomes, how do we get there? I wish I could see what's happening. This is the standard graph in economics when we talk about optimal emission reduction. So on the x-axis, we have the level of CO2 emissions, and there's two parts of this. So we have benefits and damages. The most intuitive is, of course, the damages. In general, we say that the marginal damage of emissions increases the more we emit. That means that, okay, in the beginning with Industrial Revolution, the little bit of CO2 in the air didn't really do that much. But now we're doing more and more, and every unit of carbon that we put into the air is causing more and more damage. This is why this curve is increasing. This damage depends on the physical effects of climate change, but also how do we value those aspects? There's no price tag on something like biodiversity. That's a really hard question. What is the value of biodiversity? This is also where economics comes in to say what is it worth to us to have these things, to have parks, to have clean water, to have health, etc. And we also need to deal with the future effects. How do we as economists see costs that happen in the future? Are they worth just as much as cost to us, or do we deal with them differently? So that's the damage side. And then the other curve is the benefit curve, which might be a bit more counterintuitive. But the way you can see it, it's somehow pointed? No. Oh yeah. Okay, so we start here at the business as usual emission level. So companies, countries, they're just doing as normal. And then we say, okay, what are the costs of starting to abate these emissions? In the beginning, so on the right side of the graph, it's easy to abate. We can just switch to cleaner technologies. We can make the small changes that won't cost us that much to reduce our emissions. But as we are trying to cut down more and more, we need more advanced technologies, structural changes, big impacts on society. So it's going to be super expensive to emit more or to abate more. This is why this marginal benefit curve is downward sloping. And then if we combine them, you can find a point where the costs of climate change are the lowest. And that is at the, yeah, you can see it, the crossing of the two curves, basically. Yes.
Yeah. So does the free market give us optimal reductions? The fast answer is no. Emissions give damages to third parties that are not included in the market today. It is what we call a negative externality. This means that the damage costs from emissions are not included in the price and in the business decisions we have today. So, how do we reach optimal emissions? The most important policy measures in economics today is CO2 pricing. And we here are going to talk about two different types of CO2 pricing measures. So, first we have a CO2 tax.
And looking at the figure here, we have the orange line down there is what Sophie just talked about. It is what is the social optimal emissions. But because private actors are not faced with this cost, they lie higher. Thereby, our emissions will be higher. The tax that is set per unit brings us back to the social optimal point. And what is the size of the tax? It should be equal to the social cost of carbon. That is the cost in all future years for an additional unit of CO2 today. Yes.
Yes. So do we have a CO2 tax in the EU, in Europe, anywhere? Not in Europe, at least. We have some other version of a CO2 tax. We have the emission trading system. I think most of you have already heard of it, where the EU, and Norway is part of this as well, we set a cap on emissions and we trade permits to companies to emit CO2. And then the supply and demand of these permits determine the price of CO2. So it's the opposite way around. This cap is then planned to be reduced over time. So the supply of permits is going to be less and less, with eventually the idea, of course, that there's no emissions anymore in an ideal situation. Yes, next slide. But this is not working perfect in the EU at the moment, at least. It's not much used. By far, not all carbon is actually covered by this system. Partly because it's politically very infeasible. Companies will go wild if you propose a really high carbon price on them. And for that reason, we have some other subsidies or policies to kind of compensate that and make it more politically feasible. But the main part is that the price right now in the system, that is the result of supply and demand, is too low. We saw this especially during the economic crisis around 2008, that carbon emission permits were basically free. Now, luckily, we see a huge spike in the price of these permits, which is good, but it's still not resembling the social cost of carbon that we would ideally put on this emission system.
So, is CO2 pricing enough? The answer is no. Because there are other issues in the market that makes such that we need supplemental policies. One of these areas are technology. Without technology, the only way to reduce emissions would be to reduce our own consumption. Technology weakens this relationship, and we produce too little of it. To account for this, we can have R&D subsidies to support technology development, and we can use other technologies subsidies to spread it in the market and make use of network externalities. Network externalities is when the use of a product depends on the number of users in the market, such as EV charging stations here in Norway. Also, investment tomorrow may affect investment costs, abatement costs tomorrow. Another area of market imperfections is carbon leakage, which is that when emissions are moved to countries without carbon CO2 policies, thereby making our own policy less effective. This happens because the EU climate policy affects global prices of a good, which leads to increased consumption or production in another country in the world. We can account for this by, for example, giving out free permits to sectors that are impacted, or by carbon border taxes to make market prices of goods produced here and there equal.
Yeah, so so far we've discussed optimal emission reduction. We know, okay, this is the target that we should aim for. We can use CO2 pricing to get there. We need other supplemental policies, and it's all a very nice economic package. But of course, we need to keep in mind that cost efficiency is not everything. Especially with climate change, the question is always, what is fair? Why do we mention this? Because the CO2 pricing system theoretically would imply that countries or firms that have the cheapest abatement cost, so they can do it the most efficient way, have to abate the most. What does this mean in practice? That this developing countries that are going to be the ones that have to abate. And of course, that's problematic, considering the developed countries with high abatement costs are the ones who are historically responsible for most of the emissions. So yeah, and also things like energy security, we need to think about that. So this just to highlight that cost efficiency, although economics loves it, it's not everything. So what is kind of the message we want you to take home today? Is that when we're making emission targets, we shouldn't just look at the damages of emissions, the damage of climate change, but also the other side of the spectrum. So what is it going to cost us to actually do this? And from that, we can find an optimal point. CO2 pricing is for sure the best tool in our kit available. It's cost efficient and it will really work, but we need other policies to handle with problems in the market and also think about what is fair. Yeah, I think that was it from us. Thank you for listening. Feel free to ask questions, of course. And, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
You were fast. Okay.
Thank you so much. Good. So I think I can call on the stage also Kiki and of course Shilpa. First of all, thank you so much for your presentations, super inspiring. I was asked to give a short comment. Oops, sorry. Short comment before starting to kick off the discussion. Maybe it's better to stay there for the sound because I hear, okay. Yes, maybe I can see here a few of my students, so they already know that I'm kind of obsessed with some issues. I'm a sociologist and I'm very much interested in understanding better the relation between environmental policies, climate change, and social and spatial inequalities. So I have very much appreciated that in both the presentations there was a clear attempt to consider aspects related to social, especially social inequalities, I would say. Although very much has been already told about spatial inequalities, the fact, for example, that people living in urban areas usually are more affected by heat waves and so on. And also in your presentation, it was clear an attempt to understand better at global level how these kind of regulations can work and what are the real problems and barriers in implementing these regulations, because we live in a globalized world, especially when it comes to economic production, right? So very much appreciated. I have a few considerations and questions for both of your presentations. I will start with heat waves. I come from Italy, and so last year during the summer I experienced very long, prolonged heat waves during the summer. And so I'm very much familiar with this problem and familiar with the fact that usually heat waves affect in different ways social groups living in the same country. So my first question is, yes, on the slides at some point there was written in clear letters that usually unfortunately the most vulnerable groups in terms also of social exclusion, poverty and so on are usually the most affected by heat waves. And I have a curiosity. I would like to understand what kind of research have been done on this topic, because I'm also working a little bit on the topic, take into consideration heat waves in the city of Vienna. And working with some colleagues there, yes, it was clear that also in Vienna, heat waves recently have affected people in different ways, according especially to the income level of households. And this is for different reasons. The first reason is because they can afford, for example, air conditioning. Very simple thing, air conditioning in the apartment. The second point is very often they live in green areas. So they have large gardens, they can be less affected. Another thing is that they maybe go to work in places where there is air conditioning. So it's not just an issue of residential condition. It's like what kind of condition of inequalities people experience in several domains. So for example, living, sleeping, working, where you can, for example, go to enjoy your free time. Maybe you have a second home. You can travel, you can go to the seaside, or you can go to the Hitta, and instead, people who can't afford this guy. So I think this is quite interesting. Also in the same area, for example, in this case, an urban area, we see very different conditions. So it's not just a divide, urban-rural divide when it comes to heat waves. We need a more intersectional approach in some way. And so I'm curious to understand more about what maybe we can define as social determinant of health in heat waves. This is extremely important also in terms of policies we need, and adaptation policies, because sometimes we run the risk to improve also inequalities. I'm working, for example, on possible process of gentrification due by the implementation of ecological retrofitting, nature-based solutions, and so on. So this is extremely interesting to me, and thank you for your presentation. And I have also, of course, a question also for you. Here I'm less skilled, I have to admit. So I have in sociological terms, we can tell that you have tried to explore different kind of approaches connected with economic paradigms and environmental issues related to climate change and so on. In sociology, we call what you were defining as technological innovation, in some way also issues related to free market, as the ecological modernization approach. I don't know if you're familiar with this approach. It's nice because we study the same things, but of course we give different names to what we study. In these terms, the idea is that the market will do his job. Just give them more green technologies, and people will start to buy green, because we are changing our attitude in relation to the environment. So people want to buy green. So this approach is very much like that, leave the market. But it sounds like your approach is different. You are more interested in understanding how the regulation and policies can affect this. And this is, of course, another way to deal with this issue. And finally, at least in sociology and political science, we also like to think about a more radical approach when it comes to the relation between economic growth and climate change. And we have very influential scholars here at NMBU talking about degrowth, no? Because they think, yeah, but it's very interesting to think about regulations and so on, but we live in a globalized world, as you were very well showing. I mean, they can in some way escape regulations, and at the same time the population is exploding in the world, so the technology innovation is too slow. We need to rethink in a more radical way our economic system, and they propose this idea of limiting the production in a more radical way. So I'm curious to know, first of all, if in your studies you have been dealing also with this approach, or what you think about this. So I will start from you.
Thank you for, is my microphone on? And thank you for a good question. I think you answered most of the question. And it's true that, of course, heat waves have differential impacts on populations. I showed that. And was your study in Vienna, you said? Yeah. I lived in Vienna for a very long time. And I went back recently. And it was hot, really hot. And the apartment we were renting did not have an air conditioner. And I was ready to just jump out of the window. It was way too hot in Vienna. So I can imagine that this can be, a condition for many people who live there. In general, I think it has been established that heat waves do impact cities differently, impact populations in cities very differently. So you have the elderly, you have children. And I think most of the research has been on outdoor workers, which is not so big perhaps here in Norway, but this is a huge, there has been lots and lots of studies on outdoor workers and how they suffer due to heat. And of course, the very rich live in air-conditioned houses, go to air-conditioned offices, as you say. But there are also people with baseline conditions already, suffering from heart disease or respiratory disease, and these people are more impacted by climate change. So I think that is quite well established, that literature. But I think the new literature, trying to understand how adaptation can deal with these populations, this is the new field that's come up now. And it's something that we're working on in a couple of projects. How do you design adaptation measures that actually benefit the vulnerable in the cities? And this is not so straightforward. There's very little literature in this area. So one of the classic ways you deal with heat waves is to ask your meteorological service to issue a heat wave warning, right? So you get a message on your mobile phone, just like you get for the water supplies in Vienna, you get a message saying it's going to be a heat wave. But does this actually reach the people? What exactly are you telling them to do? Don't go out. You know what, if they have to go out, if they are older people, they need food, what exactly are you providing to them as a service? And I think this has been a big shortcoming, that the heat messages don't work because you always have to go out, you always have something to do. So unless you get a clear message saying, don't go out, we will deliver foods to you, why would people just stay at home, you know? So I think this has been a big factor on how do you define adaptation and what do you do. Air conditions are a classic measure that's used, and people say we'll get rid of the problem by using air conditioning, but air conditioners have huge greenhouse gas impacts. They lead to more and more mitigation. So currently air conditioners are not sustainable. If all of us bought an air conditioner, that would be the end of the Norwegian power system, basically. So I think there's a huge debate on what exactly should adaptation propose and who should it benefit. And I think that's where the literature is still very lacking. So hopefully we can collaborate together on some projects.
Thank you very much.
We both have. But yeah, I can keep going on your point about technological degrowth or degrowth in the market in general. And I think that's very interesting, and it's not necessarily always that we have as a goal in economics. It's rather to take into all accounts and make use of all hidden values and integrate them into the market such that the market itself can decide on the optimal level after you regulate.
Yeah. So with technological innovation, especially, there's some aspects of research and development that are not captured by just the businesses themselves. So we talk about the externalities again, like one business doing research in a certain area will also benefit other businesses. So it's the benefits of doing research of technology are actually bigger than what firms themselves privately consider. And that's why government incentives like subsidies can help push put this back.
Change the incentives into giving the desired outcome, which is lowered emissions, basically.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I see a lot of questions.
Run. Thank you so much, and thank you guys for the presentations and the session. I have a question that might sound a little bit stupid, but I'm not out of the field that you guys are in, so it's mostly for the economics girls. You guys mentioned the social cost of carbon, and I'm not sure if I got to understand necessarily what does that entail. Could you please provide a bit more explanation of what that means in this sense?
Yeah. So basically, it is if you emit 1 unit of CO2 extra today at the amount of CO2 emissions that you have, if you take the effect of that unit for all future years and you discount it back to today, the sum of that is the social cost of carbon. That's the mathematical definition.
Yeah.
of it.
Okay,
Do you
so
want to add
it's
anything?
purely mathematical and it doesn't look into social impact.
Yeah, you count the damage of each year. So they say, okay, this unit of emission will cause this much damage this year, that year, that year. If you have a nice idea of what the damages will be.
But then how do
Yeah.
you define damage?
Damage is the damage of climate change to our economic system.
Oh.
And that is where the valuation comes in. Okay, maybe one extra person will die because of this 1 kilo of CO2. What does that cost us? That's the question of the social cost of carbon. Yeah.
Okay, and in that we also say that the damages are super uncertain.
Yeah, yeah.
Because there are uncertainties at every single step of the stage. It's uncertainty about the physical impacts themselves, how they will affect economic factors, and how the economic factors are valued by us as humans, and also how we value the future.
Yeah.
So there's a huge uncertainty in this number, but that's what economic is about, trying to value those.
Yeah, as a
Yeah.
sketch, we looked it up today to see, okay, what is the exact social cost of carbon calculated now? And we found answers ranging from $50 per ton of CO2 to
Yeah.
$5,500 per kilogram of CO2. So there's a lot of debate around this, and it's getting better and better. Measurements are getting more and more precise, but still, yeah, it's uncertain what exactly it's going to cost us. Yeah.
Okay. I can say from my point, just a little comment that I find it very still confusing because there's direct and indirect impacts on very specific contexts, and it
Yeah.
sounds like that has to be a very specific and importantly measured out process. And I'm a bit worried that maybe the nuance is lacking in that sense. But who am I to talk about that, right?
Yeah, the models that are being used to calculate this are insanely complicated, and yeah, I don't even understand how they do it.
Yeah.
So.
And even we learned that we shouldn't trust them as precise numbers, but rather as an indication of
Yeah.
which way the policy should go. If we should increase the tax on carbon or decrease it.
Okay.
Kind of, yeah.
Being a former environmental economist myself, I would like to add that it's actually a very important concept. And I think the US, after Biden has come into power, has done a very good job in placing a social cost on carbon. Whether it's correct or not, you could argue, infinitely. But I've been in a presentation where I met a colleague who actually calculated the health damages associated with that carbon cost. And you can disagree with her methods, but they came up, I think it was $56 the last I saw, but maybe it's gone up now. But it's a very important indicator because it tells you that what is exactly that cost of carbon to society. So I think irrespective of whether it's right or wrong, a value is very, very useful to have. And I think if it's done well, then it's, it's credible and can be used in calculations.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your presentations. When I was living in the United Arab Emirates, I heard that the government used to report the temperature to be lower than it was to not create a sense of panic, and also with cloud seeding for artificially induced rain. So, Dr. Rao, why do you think there exists variability in how heat waves are defined? Is it a tool perhaps to control the narrative on climate change?
Definition of heat waves, you mean? Is that what was your question again? I missed one word there.
Yeah, why do you think there is variability in how heat
Yeah.
waves are defined?
Yeah, because heat waves are essentially a meteorological phenomenon that are calculated by weather agencies. Now, the World Meteorological Association is the first, body of all meteorological associations together, and it has its own definition of what a heat wave should be. But at a country level, this definition may not work for you at all. You might need to create new kind of indicators. So fortunately or unfortunately, every country defines these heat waves quite differently. And the problem so far, it's not a problem that they define it differently. The problem is that they don't actually consider what the impacts on the population will be. So they come up with a measure, just like the Norwegian measure, which has been released. They have defined heat waves, but now they ask us to calculate the health damages. And if we say there are no health damages, that's just something so I think it's a question of linking better the climate and health people together, that the health people should be involved in the definition of what is actually a heat wave for your community. And I think that's where there's a big mix. And about the Emirates, yes, I have heard reports that there have been, temperatures being reduced, but that's a political, measure that people do to reduce panic in society. It's a very air-conditioned society, so you don't have all that much of impact. So I don't think it's to do with the definition of the heat wave, but it could be a lot of political reasons on how you communicate it to the public.
Thank you.
We still have time for one question. I can see here. Oh.
Thank you all for your presentations. I would have like a question more related to the economical part. So like today we see like enterprises trading with like CO2 certificates in order to compensate for their carbon emissions. So, and I'm not completely sure on what is actually the effect of those, like where those certificates, like where they actually play a key role in reducing emissions. So what are your thoughts on these tradings? And I mean, sometimes I think it's only like, you would call it like maybe greenwashing to like just for the companies to make them look better to the public society. But what are your thoughts about like these kind of measures? Are they effective?
I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what in this case would be the CO2 certificate, right?
Kind of a carbon market,
Yeah, 'cause
like
if
Red
it's
Plus.
the permit, it's not necessarily used to offset emissions, but you have to have it if you want to emit. And it's mostly for big companies that are part of this. But there are schemes, I think maybe so you referred to that, for example, developing countries can kind of buy emission reduction in other countries. And there is definitely some things to say about that, that you're just buying your way out in a way and saying, oh, look how good we're doing. They're planting trees there now. Well, we're just emitting as much as we want to. So yeah, but
the main idea behind it is that the abatement costs in other countries may be lower, and therefore it may be cost efficient to emit it in other countries. But at the same time, you have lots of different difficulties with these kinds of solutions because everyone has an incentive to kind of cheat on these credits. The people who make them have an incentive to make them higher than they actually are because they want to earn money, and other people want the offsets to be as high as possible so they can emit as high themselves. And also there is, of course, the fairness concern about, is it right that we are not going to abate ourselves? Yeah.
But pay others to do it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this nice discussion. You can continue later because I have seen some more hands on, but unfortunately we don't have time. And now, yes, we can leave the floor to Siri and to the next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. A big round of applause to the students. And Shilpa, before you leave, I would like to give you a little gift of thanks. It's the cookbook by one of our students, Elisabeth Haugou. There you go. And for those of you who might be interested, Roberta, there's one for you too. But for those of you who might be interested, there's some copies down near the entrance if you want to have a look.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for an excellent session. So we are in a learning context. after all, so it should come to no surprise to you that we're now going to have a quiz to check how much you've learned. And as my old physics teacher used to say, multiple choice, pick an answer, just don't pick your nose. But to welcome here on stage Amber, Anne, and Helene, who are going to do the quiz for us. Welcome.
Yeah. Mine is working. Oh no, yeah. Okay, so we're the last group of today, and like Siri already told, we're gonna do a quiz, but first we're gonna explain two eye-openers about daily habits to you. The first one is about meat and dairy consumption. So we're gonna do it a bit more in an interactive way to keep you guys awake because it's a long day already. So how many of you do eat meat in general? Raise your hand. It's a lot of you. And how many of you eat it weekly and daily? And it's also not just dinner, but also on bread or anything. Yeah, still a lot of people. So I think in general, all of you know that eating meat is bad for the environment. But some of you maybe don't have an idea about how bad it actually is. I'm from the Netherlands, and in the Netherlands, they launched an initiative in 2018, which is called the National Week Without Meat. And the aim of this initiative is to promote a vegetarian diet in which meat, fish, and dairy are alternated with a plant-based dishes, and then based on the realization that eating meat and dairy is harmful for the climate. Besides this goal, they also aim to create awareness among people of the positive impact of the reduced meat and dairy consumption. And of course, showing that eating plant-based can also be fun, tasty, and simple. And so with the National Week Without Meat, then you try to don't eat meat and fish for a whole week. And it's more about creating the awareness. And now I'm going to show you some numbers, and those numbers are based on if you wouldn't eat meat for one day a week for a whole year long. So if you wouldn't eat it for one day a week, a whole year long, then you would save up to 6 kilograms of meat per person per year. And besides that, you would also save a lot of water. You would save 750 liters of water per person per year. And that's the same as driving 572 kilometers with an average non-electric car. And that's the same as you would drive from Oz all the way to Trondheim airport almost. So that's a pretty long distance. And this year they added dairy to the initiative as well. And so who here eats or drinks dairy in general? And it's just milk, cheese, yogurt, whatever. And who eats it or drinks it weekly? Still a lot of people. And daily? Yeah, I figured. So if you would not eat it or drink it for one day a year, one day a week for a whole year long, you would save up to 18 kilograms of dairy per person per year. And if you would stop eating meat and dairy for one day a week for a whole year long, so both meat and dairy, then you would save up to 1,114 liters of water, which is the same as driving 921 kilometers, which is all the way from Oz to Mushin.
Mushin?
Mushin, yeah. So, well, kind of all the way, almost halfway to Norway. So that's a pretty long distance, and maybe something to think about. And the second eye-opener is about emails.
Yeah. So I'm sure we're all familiar with emails in one shape or another. You might even have gotten an email when you registered for this event.
Does anyone here know of the footprint of emails? Just nod or give a slight raise of hand. So the footprint of an email depends on its content. There are spam emails, which have 0.3 grams of CO2 equivalents. Regular emails have a footprint of 4 grams of CO2 equivalents. And emails with attachments can have up to 50 grams of CO2 equivalents as footprints. And this can seem really small when you just look at one email. But and especially with the email attachments, this will also depend on the type of attachment and its size. But when you think of all the emails going around on a daily basis, it really does add up. A UK study found that 64 million unnecessary emails are sent daily. And research suggests that if we were to reduce unnecessary emails, we could save up to 16,433 tons of CO2, which is the equivalent of removing about 3,334 diesel cars off of the roads. So this shows that like even the smallest thing can have an impact. So with these two examples, we just want to try to get you to start to think about even the small ways in which that you can do a small difference. And I hope that, you can think about just like on a daily basis, like what's the one thing I can do?
So with that, we're going to have a quiz to sum up the seminar. So we have made a quiz of 4 true and false, which sums up the seminar. So if you think it's true, then you should raise your hand with a flat hand, and everyone here should participate. That would be great. And then if you think it's false, then give us a fist in the air. And then the last question is a multiple choice. So the first one is local knowledge should be included in climate adaptation and mitigation measures. Yeah, the right answer is true. So very good. The next, fire is a tool only used to make way for agriculture. True or false? Yeah, false. Very good. Next one. The methods used to communicate climate change allows different ways of engaging with a variety of climate concerns. True or false? Yeah, very nice. The next one, the last one, air pollution is the largest cause of death in Europe. True or false? So here we have some trues and some false in the room, but the answer is unfortunately true. Yeah. So the last one is a multiple choice, and I will read the question and then the choices. So when I go through them, please raise your hand if you think it's A or B or C or D. So the first one, the question is, how much food is wasted yearly in Norway per person? Is it A, 12.3 kilograms? Who thinks it's A? No one? Is it B, 42.6 kilograms? Yeah, a few hands. C, 73.8 kilograms. More hands. And D, 45.8 kilograms. Okay, some hands. The right answer is 42.6 kilograms wasted yearly. So we have a lot to think about, everyone. But with that, we hope that you all can go home with a change in your mindset and maybe some daily habits that you want to rethink. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Dear all, the students gave me a very specific task for the concluding words of this conference. They asked me to speak from a paper that I published earlier this year entitled, "Is My Vulnerability So Different from Yours? A Call for Compassionate Climate Change Research." Understanding our relationship to climate change in new and deeper ways demands moving out of our comfort zones, and I will now move out of mine. 25 years ago, I went on fieldwork for my PhD, just a few weeks after two people I was very close to, my boyfriend and his brother, died in an accident. I felt intensely vulnerable. I was interviewing people in Tanzania and Kenya about their vulnerability to drought and floods, but I did not connect their vulnerability to mine. On a personal level, I pushed my vulnerability to the background in order to carry out my fieldwork as planned. Intellectually, I also failed to connect the vulnerability I was studying to my own vulnerability. It was as though I'd made the assumption that my vulnerability was something very different from the vulnerability of the people I was interviewing. In retrospect, I find this assumption very problematic. In one sense, it was almost colonial in nature, resonating with a we and they mentality, implicitly setting myself above those I was interviewing. The assumption could be ascribed to the inexperience of a PhD student, but also it's not without resonance to the way that vulnerability is often conceived in policy. The idea that poor people in developing countries are the most vulnerable to climate change is recounted again and again. An underlying assumption, which is also sometimes stated outright, is that we, the privileged in the global north, are not so vulnerable. Or we see invulnerability as an imagined privilege, a privilege to which we are more entitled than others, and one which is attainable. However, these assumptions have deeper implications for how we perceive our own vulnerability and our place in a shared humanity. It is a perception of vulnerability that sets us apart as different, denoting someone as more or differently vulnerable than yourself forms part of how skewed power relations are enacted in daily practice. It positions people or groups as less capable, at the same time delegitimizing their knowledge and justifying particular interventions to help the helpless, so to speak. The vulnerable others constitute an incapable or even dangerous group from which the privileged must protect themselves. Removing our shared humanity from the equation is a fault that we keep reproducing in climate change science. So was my vulnerability really qualitatively different from that of my informants? Was my vulnerability more or less worthy? Lifting my gaze from the familiar territory of climate change research, it has struck me as odd that the term vulnerability has assumed a predominantly negative and differencing, disconnecting role. After all, vulnerability is a quality that all people have in common, regardless of gender, ethnicity, livelihood, socioeconomic status, or other social dimension. It hence represents a shared experience that binds us together. There's a striking contrast between the setting apart of people within climate change vulnerability discourse and the common everyday meaning of vulnerability as ubiquitous in our lives, in our emotions, and in our relations with others. In everyday lived experiences and relations, vulnerability is a positive force in connectedness. And this is a fundamental dimension that climate change literature has largely missed. That vulnerability is inherent in the social connectedness that's critical to acting on climate change. This is not to say that we all experience the same vulnerability. Indeed, it's difficult to dispute that poor people in developing countries are often vulnerable to climate change. Instead, my argument builds on a recognition that vulnerability is universal to the human condition and unique to every single person. In my paper, I argue that a more compassionate knowing of climate change is required in order to both understand climate change and to act on it. Vulnerability needs to be understood on a deeper personal and political level, going beyond being studied as a deficiency that can be addressed through technical fixes. Compassion instead signifies identifying with, intimately connecting, and being with the other's experience through one's own experiences, compelling one to act. It can be explained as an orientation of mind that recognizes the universality of pain in human experience and the capacity to meet that pain with kindness, empathy, and patience. Compassion is felt not only for our kin, but also for others we do not know and might never meet. Furthermore, we are all in dependency relations to those anonymous others. So compassion introduces the idea of universality of suffering as the backbone of a shared humanity and how we relate to others. The pervasive and socially unjust effects of climate change on society are becoming increasingly clear. Yet scholars, policymakers, and public at large often fail to connect with what it means for our daily lives and how to act to address the problem within our lived realities, contributing to disengagement. Leshenko and O'Brien point out that the tendency within dominant problem understandings to reduce people to their individual ecological footprints and to being recipients of policy decisions disempowers ordinary people and underestimates our collective ability as political actors to transform systems. In the face of climate change, the onus is on us to not only act urgently, but to act differently, to shift current unsustainable systems. To quote Mike Hume, we need to thicken climate change knowledge by exploring ideas that will never admit a technical solution, ideas like justice, equity, goodness, humility, and democracy. The choices required to embrace uncertainty, reconcile divergent interests, and shape future developments are profoundly ethical rather than merely technical. Therefore, we need to engage with the kinds of knowledges that can serve as a compass for ethically founded action. Rather than scientific knowledge alone, wisdom is required, a deeper form of knowing that's nested in judgment of proper ways to act as gleaned from our past experiences. The multidimensional ways in which climate change is experienced in daily lives are important, including their relational, ethical, existential, and emotional. Compassionate ways of knowing go beyond merely describing vulnerability and entail deeply engaging with people's experiences. To take an example from my own fieldwork, what does it mean to lose your wife and infant to a crocodile attack during floods? What are ethically sound interventions to reduce vulnerability in this context? A compassionate knowing of vulnerability involves our emotional consciousness of other people's suffering as mirrored in our own experience of suffering. Recognizing our own vulnerability constitutes a necessary ingredient of interconnectedness with others. So while losing two people I was close to made me feel intensely vulnerable, the shared grief, which constitutes part of my vulnerability, can also be a source of emotional understanding of other people's lived experience of climate change. Radical transformation and new possibilities for ethical and political action emerge from moments of connectedness that are simultaneously enchanting and uncomfortable, such as grief. Hence, engaging with climate change as co-suffering rather than the distant suffering of others means holding discomfort. However, it's precisely this deeper relational understanding and ways of knowing that we need to mobilize in order to shift current development towards more sustainable futures. As I said at the start of the day, engaging with climate change means reimagining how we, both the students, researchers, educators, and individuals, relate to the collective, opening up space for transformative action. Many of us have made personal sacrifices to engage with climate change through our studies, research, work, or other action. And we live in the constant tension that trying to make a difference involves. I would like to quote my colleague Bruce Glavovic at Massey University, New Zealand, from an exchange we had a few days ago. He said, "Our humanity is reflected in our empathy and connection with others. It is our relatedness that makes us human. Tears and indignity and rage are all appropriate responses to the diabolical predicament we face. And it is in our relatedness and our empathy and connection that we will find ways to endure and even thrive in the face of compound adversity. I conclude this conference with the following words. Ultimately, compassion and a shared humanity are what link climate change with our lived realities. It is in our relatedness to others that agency for action lies, and in that recognition lies hope for radical change. Thank you. Oh, I would like to thank several people for their contributions to the conference. First, I would like to thank all the speakers and chairs who have contributed to making this conference a success, both for students and participants. The technicians, Vitenparken. Everything has been smooth. Thank you so much. And there's one person without whom this conference could not have happened, Pauline. So, Pauline, you've been amazing. Held everything from the practicalities to the academic content. So, big thanks. But last but not least, the students. I'm at a loss for words, actually, how impressed I am. It's been absolutely fantastic. So, students of EDS 355, could you please stand up so we can give you a big round of applause. And Handelshøyskolen, sorry, I didn't mention Handelshøyskolen, you must also stand up. Yes. Thank you. And Pauline, I do believe we asked for there to be cake for the students. There is cake, apparently, there is cake, and we have the room until 5 o'clock, so please do stay and mingle.
In the cafe.
It's in the cafe, so yes. We can have cake in the cafe.
But before we do that, of course, we also have to do a round of applause for Siri, initiating this event. It is a true inspiration to be able to work with you, and it's a true inspiration to see you explore how we can involve students more actively and use them as inspiration and utilize everyone's skills in different ways. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.